Good evening. I'd like to call our regular council meeting on Monday, January 13th to order at 6 p.m. Hello to colleagues on council. I'm Mayor McNeil Smith. Councillor Terry O'Keefe is joining the meeting, participating in the meeting online this evening. Councillor O'Keefe, good evening. If you could just confirm your connection, please.
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. Councillor Chadwin Toole will not be attending this evening's meeting with other commitments. And to my far left is Councillor Richard Novick. To my far right, Councillor Steve Duck, Councillor Sarah Duncan, and Councillor Scott Garnett. Good evening and welcome to staff in attendance at the meeting this evening. And good evening to members of the public here, both in the council chamber and to those who may be watching the meeting on the live webcast. I'll next provide a territorial acknowledgement and want to acknowledge with respect that our meeting is being held, and indeed the entire town of Sidney is in the territory of the Wasanich people. And we want to acknowledge the Sayote Nation, the Sartlip Nation, the Pakwachin Nation, the Sycam Nation, and the Malahat Nation. In turning to approval of the agenda, since the agenda was published last Thursday afternoon, there are 3 additions which I'll cover now, and we'll consider the agenda amended when we pass a motion. The first is an email of correspondence from a Ruth Poser, and that will go under item 6A, which is a development variance permit application. The second is item 13A, is an agenda item on emergency options for emergency weather response. In the staff report, reference was made to an appendix, and that appendix was inadvertently omitted and is included now on the agenda. And that is the Town of Sidney Extreme Cold Weather Response Policy. And the third is, at the end of our agenda, we will be reading a motion that is on the agenda package for the reasons that we'll be closing the meeting and going in camera. Since the agenda was published, there's a second reason for us to go in camera this evening, so there will be a second motion, and that is now considered part of the agenda as well. So with those additions, I would look for a mover, Councillor Duck, and a seconder, Councillor Novick. Any discussion on the amended agenda? I'll call the question. All in favor? None are opposed. That motion carries. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I did omit, sorry, I will do this as an amendment to the agenda. Councillor O'Keefe had requested raising the letters of correspondence sorry, item 15.2 are 12 letters of correspondence regarding the proposed Bower Bank Bikeway project, and we'll be raising those from correspondence for information, or sorry, the amendment is to raise those from correspondence for information and place them as agenda item 14B. If I could have a mover and seconder for that. Moved by Councillor Duck, seconded by Councillor Novick. All in favor? That motion carries. Thank you. We're next turning to our regular public participation period, where we provide an opportunity for members of the public to come forward and address council for up to 4 minutes. I will, when individuals do come forward, if you could please provide your name, the municipality that you reside on, and the matter that you're speaking to. We do have one individual wishing to participate in public participation via Zoom. That is Maria O'Brien. I want to say good evening to Ms. O'Brien, and if you can confirm your connection, you will have 4 minutes when you begin to address council. Good evening.
Thank you, Mayor. Are you hearing me?
Very well, thank you.
Okay. Is it my turn?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Thank you for listening to my 4 minutes. Thank you also, Chief Michelson, for a concise but detailed report of the options for Sidney to receive financial support for sheltering from a higher level of government. There are 3 options offered by BC Housing and an additional option by the Ministry of Emergency Management. The Chief also includes a do-nothing option as option 4, which is to continue the practice of transporting Sydney's unhoused to Victoria shelters. It is the cheapest and also fulfills the town's technical obligations. Nevertheless, and in spite of staff's good efforts, it has rarely been welcomed by many of Sidney's unhoused residents. An idea which occurred to me while I was working on this today is that the age distribution of Sidney's unhoused population may follow a pattern similar to the age distribution of Sidney's housed population, perhaps for many of the same reasons. Sidney's whole population is weighted heavily towards the elderly, the same factors that attract the unhoused who choose Sidney in inclement conditions over physical warmth in Victoria. Among the options outlined by Chief Michelson, it is my hope that you will choose option 1, which is to pursue the establishment of a BC Ministry of Housing EWR shelter. It will require hiring a coordinator, a significant cost, and coordination with an NGO, as well as a zoning change because no site in Sidney is currently suitably zoned. Thus, it will not materialize this year. Fortunately, the milder weather appears to be cooperating with Sidney's tardiness, and if the council will opt to begin the process necessary to work towards option 1, it will get sheltering some consideration in the 2025 strat planning process. Okay, I haven't yet used my whole 4 minutes, and another loosely related idea was prompted by reading tonight's agenda package. What caught my attention is that staff are recommending that Beacon Community Services are to be denied tax exemptions on their thrift store properties. I imagine this is justified by the fact that the stores earn money. But when I thought about possible NGOs for the town to partner with for sheltering in Sidney, Beacon Community Services came to mind quickly. They provide the town's resident population with so many services that are typically provided by municipal governments. I am not party to the details of contracts between Beacon and the town. Yet their thrift stores, a major source of their support, also provide lonely volunteers with valuable socialization and others with valuable training in occupations that are seriously needed in Sidney. They are being denied tax exemptions given to other public service organizations. I personally recommend changing this tonight. It seems to me that a change could set a positive tone in an area where negotiations could soon become fruitful. Thank you for listening. Thank you all for your attention, and to the chief for his work.
Thank you for addressing council this evening, Ms. O'Brien, and taking the time to provide us your remarks. Just one point of clarification. It's not on the agenda this evening with regards to permissive tax exemption for Beacon Community Services. You may be aware of that, but just to clarify, that was considered at a previous council meeting.
Oh, you mean I was reading something from the past?
No, that's fine. But I just wanted to clarify that our council, in fact, did provide a permissive tax exemption to Beacon Community Services for the operation of their operations at the Shoal Centre. We did deny, which is one of their major activities in Sidney. Council did not provide a newly requested permissive tax exemption for their 2 retail thrift shops in the downtown. So I won't comment on it further, but those were considerations made by council and decisions from council. So thank you again for your general remarks or your other remarks this evening.
I guess I was reading what had already happened.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you again. If you're able, Ms. O'Brien, perhaps it would be helpful if you disconnected and reconnected watching the live web stream. It's just with the spaces and information that we have on our screen, that would be helpful. Thank you. I'll call for a second time for anyone wishing to come forward to address council. Please come forward. We have 3 people wanting to come forward. Please, good evening. Go ahead.
Eric Payne, long-time Sidney resident. Just press the microphone button.
Yeah, it just makes the microphone live there. One more press, Mr. Payne.
That's it?
No, just so you get a red light on your mic. It makes it live.
Oh, we have a red light. Eric Payne, 2133 Malaview, longtime Sidney resident, veteran cyclist, and for the last
5 years, somebody who walks a dog 3 or 4 times a day through the Bower Bank corridor. So I'm here to talk about the Bower Bank issue, the traffic flow. And as a result of the walking, in the last month, I have talked with 20, at least 20, maybe 25 other people. Dog walkers tend to talk a lot. And said, what do you think about the Bower Bank? I know we're late, but what do you think about it? 2 people approve of it. The remaining 18, 20 did not. They disapprove, and quite strongly so. Amongst those people are working people, retired people, and 2 or 3 families with young children going to Sidney Elementary School. The overwhelming feeling is there really isn't an issue. That if there is an issue with the bike path, there's a perfectly good bike path up there. And if there's an issue with it, then the town of Sidney could perhaps be working with the CRD and or the RCMP to sort those issues out, as opposed to offsetting it with a plan that is going to cause a greater problem for a far greater number of voters. There's no doubt speed on Bower Bank and Siddle is excessive. Siddle should immediately be reduced to 30 kilometers an hour speed limit. Bower Bank's 30, why is Siddle 50? At the same time, perhaps the engineering department could investigate not speed bumps, but speed humps, the more gradual and much deeper traffic slowing devices. You'll find them on, and I wrote it down here somewhere, Bourne and Aldous Terrace up off Amity Drive. Something that will slow traffic but will not impede the operation of a snowplow. The installation of such things would do 2 things. One, it would drastically reduce speed on Bower Bank and Siddle, and may well deter much of the transient traffic who will go other places, people who don't want to drive over speed bumps. At the very least, I think the issue deserves a public forum, if not removal. Death on the order papers, they say in Ottawa. Gardy Gardam, the former Lieutenant Governor of BC, had 3 rules to public speaking: stand up to be seen, speak up to be heard, and shut up to be appreciated. So I will shut up, sit down for a few minutes, and go home because my dinner is waiting. Your Worship, councillors, thank you, and a belated Happy New Year to one and all.
Thank you for coming forward this evening, Mr. Payne. I'll turn to our next speaker. Good evening.
Good evening, council, staff, and members of the public. My name's Eric Diller, resident of Sidney, and I too would like to speak to item 14B on the agenda. And yeah, very disappointed to see so many people misunderstanding what I feel is the situation on Bower Bank. If we go back in time to the previous official community plan that this town had, before the present one, we see that there was a need seen by residents to improve conditions for active transportation within the town. Fast forward to the public participation that we saw prior to the implementation of the current official community plan, and we again saw that there was considerable willingness to see conditions improved for active transportation within the town. And finally, there was the active transportation strategy that was brought forward by this council, which I very much appreciated. And despite the fact that the public participation for that strategy was done at pretty much the worst time of year. Again, and I will acknowledge that there was some opposition to that plan, and it was watered down. It was a compromise. The Bower Bank plan was brought forward, and even though, again, it is a compromise, I appreciate it. And having been a person who cycles regularly along Bower Bank with my young children, and as a person who has been struck by a motor vehicle while riding my bike on Bower Bank, I was passed on the inside by a motor vehicle while going around the Amelia roundabout. Definitely, this plan needs to move forward as designed. The safety of the town's residents should never come before the convenience of a few drivers. Thank you.
Thank you for coming forward this evening. I'll turn to our next speaker. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me, Council, Mayor, distinguished guests. I just recently moved out here from Vancouver, so it's a beautiful town. I would like to speak on your extreme weather report. I used to work for the City of Vancouver, working with marginalized people, mental health and addictions. So if there's anything I can do in that sense, I just wanted to bring forth that I do have that experience, and anything that you need, or if there's any questions that you need to have that work, I have connections with BC Housing, Director of City of Vancouver, and so that's all there with my experience, and I would like to hopefully help with mental health, addiction, and make sure that's gonna keeping safe for Sidney, if that's okay.
Just before you continue, if you could just provide your name, please.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Cameron, full name is Cameron Rizai.
Thank you very much.
Awesome, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming forward this evening.
Yeah.
Good evening.
Hi there, my name's Gwen Davey. I am a resident of Sidney. I live on Ardwell Avenue, and I have a few questions regarding the Bower Bank Bicycle Boulevard. I don't expect you to answer because this isn't the forum, but I just would like to pose a few questions. How many of the consultants that worked on the active transportation plan actually walked down to Bower Bank and did a site survey? And I'm not talking about the amount of traffic that goes down Bower Bank, then you extrapolate the statistics. I'm talking about how many people have actually gone down there and counted bicycles. Ardwell, I live on Ardwell. I go down Ardwell and turn right onto Resthaven every time I have to go somewhere. Ardwell is a blind corner. Now, this was brought up in previous meetings by Councillor Duncan. She's aware because she lives on Ardwell, I believe. And when you go down Ardwell and you turn right onto Resthaven, your vision is limited as to what's coming from the angle of the ferries. And I can't tell you how many times I have gone down, turned right, usually have a pickup truck, come flying up behind me, laying on the horn because I didn't see him because of the blind corner, and he didn't see me because of the blind corner. And I turned right when I thought it was safe to do so. And this has happened to me on many occasions because of the angle of Resthaven. Now, if I had been turning left, I could have very easily been T-boned by the vehicles coming that way. I'm just wondering if, like I said, has anybody done a site survey? Has anybody walked to the Ardwell corner? Because if Bower Bank is cut off and the traffic is funneled down Ardwell to Resthaven, people that cross at Resthaven don't even use the flashing sidewalk sign. So that's an extra detriment. And I feel that funneling traffic down Ardwell to turn onto Resthaven because they can't use the cyclist, they can't use the Bower Bank Road would be a real detriment, and it would not basically solve anything. I think it would be I think it would be creating more traffic congestion and more of a hazard on that sign. So as Brother Payne said, I would like to see if there could possibly be an open house on this matter. I'm all for bicycles, don't get me wrong. I have a bicycle, I use it, I walk sometimes a couple hours a day, sometimes not. But I think there are better ways to stem the traffic flow on Bower Bank by using possible speed bumps, traffic calming devices, rather than shutting off the whole road and funneling all the traffic down to Resthaven to a blind corner, which in my mind is extremely dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you for coming forward, Stevie.
Sorry?
Thank you for coming forward this evening. Good evening.
Good evening, Mayor and Councillors. My name is Kelly Duncan. I'm a resident of Sidney and priest at St. Andrew's Anglican Church here in Sidney. I rise to speak tonight to the report to Council regarding options to establish an extreme weather response shelter, item 13A on the agenda. The first thing that I'd like to address is need for an extreme weather response shelter. In the report, option number 4 appears to question the need for such a shelter, noting that few underhoused individuals have accepted transportation to other places, which is part of the town's current response plan. I would like to counter that conclusion. We at St. Andrews feed the underhoused 5 days a week. We know many people's names. They have entrusted us with their stories. They have ties to this community, a place where they at least get some support. It is therefore no surprise that they'd rather keep close to the place they know and love, rather than being transported elsewhere. We would like to suggest that Sidney's current plan is not sufficient. It does not reflect an understanding of our underhoused population here. Think of it. The only response that the town of Sidney offers in an extreme weather event is considered by those we are trying to help to be worse than potentially freezing to death. This demonstrates how woefully lacking the current plan is. While it's helpful that Council has asked for and staff has prepared this report, what perhaps is more important at all stages going forward is a commitment to leadership and a recognition that this is an important issue that needs to be addressed as a community. Option number 1 entails identifying and partnering with an NGO. It would seem unusual that response to extreme weather would need to be addressed by an NGO. In the province where there is an area that needs a school, the province doesn't say that an NGO is needed to start a school. And where there are potholes in the road, the municipality doesn't ask an NGO to pull together the resources to fill it. Rather, the governments understand schools and road safety respectively as their responsibility. They take care of those responsibilities for the greater good. At the same time, it seems unlikely that an NGO, organizations which are often notoriously underfunded, would be able to easily handle the setup of an emergency weather response shelter in comparison to the relatively well-funded levels of government. It seems to me that the only chance for success is to partner together. I understand that a partnership has occurred recently in Saanich, where the municipality is working hand in hand with a local United Church to put together an emergency weather shelter. It seems to me that what won't work is if a municipality views itself as a regulator, putting up hoops to be jumped through rather than offering leadership and a willingness to leverage our collective abilities. St. Andrews, and I would expect other community groups who are connected with the underhoused, is eager to offer our experience and time to find a way to protect those that are underhoused during extreme weather events. That's only possible if the town of Sidney wants this to happen. I hope that you will consider offering leadership in a way forward where we can work together. Thank you.
Thank you for coming forward this evening.
Point of order. We motion on the floor to extend public participation.
Moved by Councillor Duck,
Second.
seconded by Councillor Gurnett. All in favor? Seeing none opposed, the motion carries. Thank you, thank you, Councillor Duck. Please come forward.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. My name is Gerald Moffat. I live at 9512 Lockside Drive here in Sidney. Tonight I wish to talk about emergency housing in Sidney. the problem is larger than just the EWR topic on tonight's agenda. It should be looked at more broadly in terms of meeting the needs of the homeless on an ongoing basis, not just in extreme weather. However, tonight I will just discuss the EWR and simply in the terms of the 4 options presented by staff. Option 4, offering transport to EWR in other municipalities, knowing it will not likely be accepted, is a non-starter. This despite it being the status quo. It protects the town rather than the vulnerable homeless. Legally permissible, but ethically odious. Options 2 and 3. To spend large sums on staff and institutional apparatus rather than providing more direct aid is counterproductive. For example, the $100,000 or more just for a manager could annually provide about 800 person days of overnight stay at $125 a day, roughly comparable to the off-season motel rate, 800 person days. And that's without staff under that manager. Of the options presented by town staff, I beg your pardon, this leaves only option 1. This option relies on an NGO to do the heavy lifting. Unfortunately, this ratifies the shirking and offloading of the responsibility of the province's Ministry of Housing. We're stuck with that, I guess. It may be the limit of the possible in the short term. Council should pursue option 1 rather, but should also continue to look for better alternatives beyond the 4 presented by staff. Perhaps taking some leads and hints from the town of Saanich. Moreover, Council should be willing to provide greater financial support to option 4. If $100,000 for a manager is even worthy of consideration, then the $5,000 startup money for option 4 is a pittance, 20 times less. A community's humanity is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members. After all, if the town can afford $500,000 for a downtown outhouse, surely we can look after the town's most vulnerable homeless. I urge Council to act on this and act promptly and not kick it down the road yet another year. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you for coming forward this evening. Please come forward.
Hello. My name is Jamie Wellborn, and I live in the Bowerbank area. I'm here to speak to Bowerbank again. I know I was here last month, but I had a little more to add and saw you had some more opposition. The world is on fire these days. The recent LA fires are a topical example, but don't forget Lytton, Fort McMurray, Kelowna, not to mention the floods of 2021 across BC. Sydney's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions is community transportation, at 39% according to the CRD's 2021 emissions inventory report. We must work to reduce our reliance on motor vehicles to reduce our impact on the environment. The only way to do that is to design our streets in a way that makes cycling, walking, and public transit as comfortable and convenient as driving is now. The changes to Bowerbank will help with that. The number of cyclists using Bowerbank now is irrelevant because the current street design discourages cycling and encourages driving. That said, I do see at least 1 or more cyclists on Bowerbank nearly every time I ride out on my own bike, rain or shine, day or night. I've spoken with multiple cyclists that are in favor of these changes. The complaints you've heard tonight from opponents and in the correspondence are primarily focused on how this inconveniences drivers. There is talk of more public input, but plenty was already given during the ATP process. Please continue with the project on Bowerbank as planned, and all other projects that put public safety ahead of driver convenience. Thank you for your time. And a side note, I rode my bike here and I took Bowerbank.
Thank you for coming forward this evening. I'll call for a third and final time if there's anyone wishing to come forward. Seeing none, I'll close the public participation. Council, given the number of individuals who have come forward this evening with regards to the Bowerbank and given that council has decided to raise the 12 letters of correspondence to correspondence for information, that is to correspondence, that is coming fairly along in the agenda. I would anticipate it would be possibly an hour and a half, if not 2 hours from now. So I would seek a motion from council to raise, to move the consideration of the letters of correspondence from the Bower Bank residents from agenda item 14B and move it up after the presentation from the museum. The museum is a presenter this evening, a delegation that has been confirmed. So I think it appropriate to proceed with that delegation first. So I will turn to council if it's their wish to move that correspondence for discussion closer to now on the agenda. Councillor O'Keefe?
I'll move that we move that item up on the agenda.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? I'll second it for discussion. Councillor O'Keefe, if you want to motivate first, please.
Sure. I'm not in chambers, but I gather from your comments that there are a number of people there, and rather than having them sit through possibly 2 hours of discussions on other things, it seems to be best to move this up and expedite the issue.
Thank you. Councillor O'Keefe, you just sounded a little faint. We're just trying to adjust, possibly adjust the volume at our end. I don't know if you can adjust it at your end. Could you just try speaking again for a moment?
Sure. So is that better? Shall I motivate again?
No, that's fine. It's not a lot better, but I think council is certainly able to hear you and perhaps most of the gallery. I'll motivate very briefly. Council, I don't, and to members of the public who have come forward on this evening, it wasn't on our agenda as an agenda item, and so I don't anticipate that council will speak at great length on the project this evening. We weren't prepared to do that. We don't have reports regarding the bikeway or the active transportation plan on our agenda. So I'm in favor of having a shorter discussion of these correspondence that we've received, both by the letters and the speakers this evening. I'll turn to council if there's any further discussion. If not, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Duck, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Garnett, and Councillor Novick are opposed. The motion fails, so it will remain as item 14B and will be later this evening. Thank you, council, for your consideration. I'll next turn to our presentation this evening. We're pleased to have Michael Goodchild, Executive Director, and Sidney Museum Board Chair Shannon Newstater to present the museum's 2024 annual report and 2025 business plan.
Great. One moment, please. Good evening, Mayor and Council, staff and distinguished guests. My name is Michael Goodchild, Executive Director at the Sidney Museum and Archives, and I wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to present on behalf of the museum as I share some highlights from our 2024 annual report and 2025 business plan. Now, my intent this evening with my time is to provide a summary of our activities in 24, including exhibits, outreach, and our updated strategic plan for 2025 through 27. And then I will close with plans for the coming year, including our planned major feature exhibit, anticipated completion of the long-awaited waterfront signage revitalization, and an update on our plans for permanent gallery renovations over the next 3 years. Sidney Museum, thankfully, continues to benefit from a core team of 3 and has done so for the last couple of years. In addition, we were fortunate enough to get 4 contract staff in 2024. All these positions were successfully funded from a variety of sources, from Young Canada Works, Canada Summer Jobs, and the BC Community Gaming Grant. While this does necessitate time spent by staff training, interviewing, and onboarding, it provides huge amounts of resources that the museum can then leverage to completing ongoing projects, complete backlogs in our archives and collections, as well as provide more flexibility for core staff throughout the year. And this year certainly proved that in my view. Some of these staff members have stayed on as volunteers as well, enhancing the long-term collective resources of the museum. As of 2024, our financial and visitorial strength remains stable. Our 2024 end-of-year operating budget was projected at $234,000. Actual numbers are coming in this week, so our closing operating revenue was actually $288,000, with an additional project revenue of $37,000. Although, given increased expenses and staff, we're breaking even at about $743 for the year. The aforementioned successful grants and extremely positive reception to the Lego exhibition at the start of last year are the biggest contributors toward that. Our 2025 operating budget takes into account our ongoing 5-year lease and operating agreement with the town. As such, I just want to make it known that we are not requesting an increase in support financially from the town of Sidney beyond the adjustments with the Consumer Price Index. And I recognize that the amount that I provided was projected and may be subject to change. As ever, we're extremely grateful for the support that we get from the town, the support that I have received, and I hope to continue to be worthy of that in the coming years. Now, visitor attendance for 2024 was extremely strong. We had around 21,000 visitors in 24, which is about 8,000 more than we got the preceding year. Over 17,000 of those identified as local, coming from the Saanich Peninsula, which shows that community interest and support for the Sidney Museum remains stronger than ever, and if anything, is growing. Likewise, our donations in 2024 were very strong. Again, the Lego exhibit was one of the biggest contributors toward this. And we are looking at incorporating additional revenue generation opportunities into our strategic planning while striving to maintain the museum as an admission by donation organization. It's something that pretty much all levels of the organization feel very strongly about. I have no interest in changing. As long as we can afford to be admission by donation, we will continue to be. And taking into account our December donations, our 2024 numbers were very, very strong indeed. And we were projected at 84% earned revenue as opposed to contributed revenue. So that is to say, revenue that we receive through donations, grants, sponsorship, project support, compared to the municipal support that we receive from the town of Sidney and the district of North Saanich. And as you can see, our numbers for 2024 are looking very good. One of the reasons for this was we applied for 11 grants in 2024, of which 9 were successful. These include BC Gaming, Canada Summer Jobs, Young Canada Works, and the Canadian Museum Association and BC Museum Association's Family Day and Bursary Professional Development Grants. This is something we will continue into the new year. Volunteer contributions. We remain strong with 35 active volunteers, and they contributed an astonishing 2,800 hours of their time last year. They are the face of the organization. They make possible virtually everything my colleagues and I do. So as such, volunteer appreciation and giving back to the community is a major focus of our outreach and volunteer coordinator. And my assistant director and I are working to improve our documentation and record keeping with regards to volunteer training, onboarding, and safety procedures. And we're doing that in line with some of the accessibility and safety plans that the town of Sidney is doing to make sure that we're adhering to the same rules. Likewise, our outreach volunteer coordinator continues to involve the museum in community events. So various initiatives throughout 2024 saw us receive around 4,700 engagements, about half of which were during the Sidney Street Market, which we will be participating in again. In addition, we had a number of additional opening, closing receptions, public speaking events, film screenings, and I want to draw special attention to a couple of documentaries, Kuklachis and Shalingan Kuklachis, during our Living Languages exhibition, which we also were able to invite elders and knowledge keepers from the Saanich Leadership Council, and for that I wish to say thank you very much to them for their support. It was a privilege to host them. Now, in 2024, we organised 3 featured exhibits and a number of pop-ups and seasonal displays. The 3 big ones, though, was our Lego exhibition. The 2025 version is now up and running and has been since the 20th of December. Our Living Languages, First People's Voices in BC, which ran April to July, which was a partnership between us, the Royal BC Museum, and the First People's Cultural Council. We also had additional vetting and verification work done by the Wasanish Leadership Council and School Board. That saw approximately 2,500 visitors during its runtime, with many more visitors in public programs. And our second major featured exhibit was Lost Liberties, the War Measures Act, which ran from August through November, which was from the Canadian Museum of History, exploring the implementation of the eponymous act. And our numbers for 2024 came to about 2,100 for the period, exceeding 2023's number by about 800. So again, it confirms that interest in these discussions, and particularly every effort we have to provide a local connection to the Saanich Peninsula, is something that the public wants to see, and I'm going to continue trying to do. Collections and archives, briefly, the work continues apace. We have 3 storage rooms for our 8,000 historical objects. Last year, we deaccessioned 760 items, whether due to lack of provenance, confirmation that their provenance originated outside of the peninsula and so had nothing to do with us, or due to their fading condition in comparison to other better versions. We also accessioned 65 new items entered into our permanent collection. Archives has been going very well indeed, thanks in large part, in full part, to our archives manager, Jessica Payne. She and her 2 assistant staff have done incredible work over the last year. We have completed many goals, including but not limited to backups of all of our digitized archival materials that are now safe, processing over 7,700 photo negatives in our photography collection, and uploading an additional 5 years of the Peninsula News Review digitized to our online repository, accessible to everyone. There are a number of projects on the go, but the one that I want to touch on briefly is the waterfront signage project. What is shown on the slideshow right now is the most recent version of the proposed final draft to replace the existing panels. As of the end of the year, all 13 panels that are proposed have had images sourced, text drafted, have all been paid for. Funds have been paid out to Peninsula Signs, the Wasanish Leadership Council, and to stay-out artist Doug LaFortune, and he has contributed unique artwork that will feature on 3 of these panels at least. We've dispersed the majority of the project funds, which is a major step for us as a team. Next steps include verifying that the Sanchothin text and Saanich history depicted is accepted by the Leadership Council. They're in the process of vetting that right now. We will then receive and distribute the final drafts from Peninsula Signs that we will share with project partners, including yourselves, Town of Sidney. We're hoping at this point for a April/May installation. The panels themselves, the fabricated panels, are also ready to go. They've just been kept in the yards over the Christmas period. And then hopefully a unveiling ceremony with public participation in May, fingers crossed. Eric Pelkey, hereditary chief of the Sayout Nation, has also expressed interest in potentially organizing a blessing ceremony and drum circle that could take place at Beacon Park or Iroquois Park. Further logistics for that are needed, but it's wonderful that they're so supportive of the work that we're doing. I'm very quickly approaching the end of my allotted time, so provided a very brief summary of our plans for 2025. We're opting for a single major featured exhibit, Health in Space, Daring to Explore. This is from the Canada Aviation and Space Museum. We're hoping to run from May through November. Now, this is a very interactive, tactile, object-rich exhibit that we will be seeking funding support through the Exhibit Circulation Fund to ensure that our operational budget remains stable. Now, we're picking this single long-running exhibit because one of our big goals for this year is to develop a revitalization plan for the museum's permanent galleries. They have not seen meaningful change since about 2021, and some of the displays are static and are in need of refreshment. But instead of simply moving displays around, replacing a couple of objects, we want to reimagine what the space could look like, providing a historical walkthrough of the history of the period with Saanich history and worldviews incorporated, while not forgetting about the industrial and economic history that is so important to the region. And very, very finally, very briefly, one of the biggest projects we worked on last year was the implementation of a new strategic plan to replace the one initially drafted in 2017 and updated in 2021. The summary is provided and the full package has been provided to Mayor and Council, so I won't touch on it too much here, but just to know that implementing this plan is starting very, very soon. We have a board meeting coming up this Saturday to go over it, and I don't believe any changes will be made, at least from our perspective, but we are always open to comments and feedback. It's a privilege to continue to represent Sidney Museum and the town, and the work that we do is something that is very important to a huge number of people, and I want to do everything in my power to be worthy of that support, not only from the community, but also from yourselves. So thank you very much for hearing my incredibly condensed summary, and I turn the proverbial mic back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Goodchild, for your passionate and positive presentation. I like that photo. Guess the age of the vehicles. Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you to your volunteer board, to your mighty staff team, and to the incredible volunteers that make the museum such a welcoming place. And congratulations on the success of increasing the interest of the exhibits, not only the permanent exhibits, but the feature exhibits that come to the museum. I know council members have accepted invitations and have enjoyed those exhibits as well. So thank you very much. I'll turn it to colleagues if there are any questions or further comments. Councillor Gurnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Michael, for your presentation, and thank you, Shannon, for being here, and Isabel, volunteer as well in the front row. Great to have that support for you. And I won't echo the comments of the Mayor, but well done, and to everyone that's involved. A couple of questions I have to ask you. Just, it's been 3.5 weeks since you started the Lego exhibit. How's it going? What's the trend? Oh, okay, looking at Shannon, pretty good apparently.
It's been intense. So December of last year, we closed the year with having received around, I think it was 1,400 visitors for the whole month, which is quite a lot, but not overtly more than what we get in other months. December of this year, we had around just under 9,000 visitors. About 8,000 of them came in the last 10 days when Lego opened. It's been just astonishing. The support that people have, the love, the enthusiasm is infectious. It's sort of a victim of its own success in that we have had days, especially on the weekends, where it's been far busier than the staff and volunteers scheduled were anticipating. It's a nice problem to have, and it's something we can build for and anticipate for. But yeah, it's been going very well so far.
Oh, wow, that's bow down to you there. That's a lot of people in a small space. At the last board meeting in November, my recollection was the seat at the table was the exhibit, and now I see a change. So I'm just wondering what prompted the change to the exhibit.
The seat at the table's availability is what prompted the change. We had been conversing with, because I think that's the Chinese Canadian Museum, so they had initially said, yep, it's available, we can run it from the spring, we can extend it if you wish, and right up until just after the board meeting, that was the plan. The immediate following week, I received an email from them saying that they had got their wires crossed. Turns out the exhibit has actually been booked somewhere else. This other place came through with the funding, so we had to find an alternative. So I've been maintaining a number of potential traveling exhibitions. This was another one that had been made, I'd been made aware of earlier in the year. What held me off from going with it was that it had a more questionable link locally. However, the health in space, the exhibit we're looking at now, is a big focus on the training and rigors that Canadian astronauts have to go through in order to get into space. And a lot of that has parallels with some of the history we have with the Victoria Airport pilots and the aerodrome that predates the international airport. So my staff and I are pretty confident we can create some good local connections, and in the same way that we do for our other traveling exhibits, create something that residents and visitors to the peninsula can latch onto.
That's fabulous. It's great to see that connection that you're making. And just one last question. When I'm looking at the updated signage locations, number 13, Women's History in Sidney, was there any contemplation given to maybe providing a more prominent location in downtown somewhere, as opposed to Iroquois Park?
I would certainly be open to that. The only reason I didn't suggest it was because I would assume I would have had to brought the question up with Mayor and Council to see if they would accept it. Because right now we have Sydney's Chinatown that is hopefully slated to go between 4th and 5th Avenue where the Chinatown used to stand. But with regards to women's history in Sydney, it can absolutely go in a different location. I was merely picking the location of an existing sign because it seemed neat, but that can definitely be subject to change, definitely.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Gurnett. I'll turn to Councillor Duck.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you again for that great presentation. And I've been proud to be part of some of the, to have attended the presentations you've put on and thoroughly enjoyed it. A quick question, since you've changed the major focus of the show, are you working in conjunction with the Aviation Museum in town as well to sort of do some cooperative work that maybe duplicate or complementary presentations?
Absolutely. So Peter Garnham, who is on the Board of Directors at Sydney Museum, is also on the Board of Directors at the Aviation Museum, and he has expressed interest in collaborating between our two organizations to provide the information we want to include. He also has a few personal connections with people who may be able to provide public speaking series on the experience of being a Canadian astronaut. But we're going to leverage our existing relationship with the Aviation Museum for the development of this exhibit. It's what we have on the books for the next 3 months.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Great, thank you, Councillor. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan and Councillor Novak.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, you've been working on this sign project for a long time, which is outside of the museum, and I feel like that's the only thing you have that's kind of in your purview that's going to be outside the museum proper. And as that's winding to a close, I'm wondering if there's anything that's starting to ferment about something else that you might do outside. And just the reason I ask is that we routinely have people who kind of have come forward talking about historical buildings in Sydney, and plaques on buildings for notable things. And it's not, Sydney doesn't have very many of those kind of locations. And I know there are a few things, like the Little Anchor location that's near the front, and the Anchor of the Iroquois that's in the park. If there is anything to your knowledge that was elsewhere out in Sydney that once the sign project is done could be another kind of sign project that might be within your purview.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. There are a number of local landmarks and sort of hidden histories in and around the town of Sydney that I've been made aware of through the On This Spot, the historical walking tours, the self-guided tours that were set up by Alyssa before I started. That's actually where this image is lifted from. It was a superimposed historical archival photo over a contemporary of Beacon Avenue. That's something that I haven't been giving a lot of thought in terms of what comes next, because this project has been extended far longer than anyone would have preferred. I'm eager to see it done. So I've basically been having all of our attention focused on getting it finished. That being said, additional projects like that where we can highlight local history beyond the physical confines of the museum, particularly given that we are fairly limited where we are physically underground as we were, I would definitely be enthused about pursuing that further. And I'll have a conversation with my staff about that.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Michael, for a wonderful presentation.
Microphone, please, Councillor. Thank you.
And congratulations for really doing an amazing job of getting the museum to the next level. It's particularly gratifying for me, as I'm sure you're aware, to see where the museum has come after all these years. To go back to your presentation, I'm looking at the monthly attendance report. I don't know if you want to put it on the screen. I think it was your second or third slide.
Sure.
There you go. Yeah, it's great to see attendance increasing for Lego, but I'm looking at the months of June, July, August, maybe the last bit of May and early part of September, which is our high season in terms of tourism, and you would think that there is an increase in the number of people in Sydney and transient traffic, yet and this is not a reflection on you, because this has been historically what the traffic patterns have looked like, that summers have been somewhat challenging, certainly compared to the Lego exhibit, but I'm wondering if you've given any thought to what can be done to maybe market more to the tourist community that comes into town in terms of exhibition selection, in terms of maybe special projects or anything else that might help to see those summer numbers gradually climb upward.
Absolutely, thank you. Yes, it's a conversation that we've been having exhaustively at the museum as well, because despite efforts made by myself, my predecessor, by Mr. Garnham, that has historically been the trend. So we are approaching that through our strategic planning in three core ways. One is re-examining and assessing our traveling exhibits. What do we get during the summer months? Are they tactile? Are they engaging? Is their purpose to inform or to entertain? Can we find a balance between the two? And that is largely dictated by what traveling exhibits are available or what we have the time to develop in-house. So we're hoping the exhibit we have planned for this summer is a very sort of family-friendly exhibit. It sort of deals with topics that we're hoping will be broadly interesting, particularly to tourist groups coming in. It's quite a high-profile exhibit that has had quite a successful runtime up to this point. So we're hoping that that will translate to a spike in visitorship during the summer months. We're also constantly pushing into getting more involved in the community. So the Sidney Street Market is a fairly recent example. We've been doing that for a couple of years. Last year, we were invited to participate in the Honouring Waitanmi powwow over at the soccer fields at the Saanich, I believe it was Stay Out. So that's a few of, we're also looking into other public events where the museum can make itself known, put in an appearance to kind of keep people aware of where we are and what we're doing. There have also been a couple of conversations at improving the space immediately outside the museum where the railing is, adding some kind of visual Velcro to catch people's attention more effectively than what has been done at the moment. And we are limited given the space that we occupy, but we want to try and push as much as we can to make ourselves known to people who are just walking down the street. So if they see the signs, they'll go, oh, there's a museum. I didn't know. I want to go and check it out. Because we get so many people who come in, even year after year, who say, oh, I've lived in Sydney for 10, 20, 30 years. I had no idea there was a museum here. And that just seems to be a trend. So I mentioned outreach, I've mentioned traveling exhibits, but then the third piece is why I'm interested in us re-examining and potentially revitalizing our permanent displays. That's on the first floor of the museum. It's the first thing the majority of people see, even people who are coming in for the traveling shows. And there is a lot of room for improvement. There's a lot of ways that we can make it more eye-catching, make it more tactile and hands-on. We have some interactivity there, which always gets a lot of attention, but that's proof to me that there is a hunger for more interactivity. You know, we're in a world where museums are increasingly facing that conversation of how can we be relevant when so much of the information we provide and interpret is just available online. Someone with a phone can pull it out and then get all the information they could possibly want. So how do we engage with the community and make them want to occupy our space? Offering our meeting rooms for groups and non-profit organizations, offering our museum for school groups and community groups such as those. So we just had a Girl Guides group that came to the museum to do a sleepover, which went really well from what I hear. And we're also developing education kits that can go outside the museum and go to schools where staff or volunteers can present an education piece that is created by the museum staff and volunteers and is also adhering to the BC curriculum. So it's a way for us to project ourselves beyond our physical location. So those are the three ways we're trying to address that, and I'm hoping that it will bear fruit in time.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you again. Councillor O'Keefe, I'm sorry, you've moved on the screen, but that's not your fault.
Sorry.
That's not your fault. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michael. That was a great presentation. A few things that stood out for me that I was happy to see. Really impressed at what you've done in terms of expansion of community involvement, your success with the grant programs. Excited to see that the signage project is going to come to fruition this year. Also really happy about all the work you're doing with local First Nations. And museums are in a unique and very important position, I think, to help our community work towards reconciliation. And so I think you're doing a really good job on that, and thank you for that. One question I have is about going back to the lull in the summer months, is whether you've had any discussions with Destination Victoria about attracting more tourists out here. In discussions that I've had at their different events, they're putting together a Saanich Peninsula tourism strategy. They're looking for ways to get convention visitors, cruise ship visitors, to give them different types of itineraries and spread them out outside of the Victoria core. One of the things they had talked about was perhaps a history buff tour that would involve Sidney Museum and the Saanich artifacts, and maybe the airplane museum as well. So any thoughts on that?
Yes, definitely, and thank you for bringing that up. There have been conversations going on throughout 2024 between the Shore Centre for the Salish Sea, the Aviation Museum, and Sidney Museum on leveraging our resources to co-market for each other for the mutual benefit of all. I am aware of the Attractions Victoria and their work in the tourism sector, and it's something that I'm keeping an eye on, and I'm getting myself and other staff involved in whatever conferences and meetings that take place, and letting other people in that organization know that we are here and we are interested. I know that we have a membership with Attractions Victoria, I believe an annual membership, and we do feature on their website, but that's only a good start. There's certainly more growth there, and that's one of the directions we're leaning in for sure.
Great, thank you for that. That's all for me.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe, and thank you once again, Michael Goodchild. We wish you every success in the future. Thank you. Next on our agenda, Council, is number 6, development permits, and we have under 6A, development variance permit application number DV100363 at 10440 Resthaven Drive to increase the maximum percentage of the parking area within the front yard to allow for the construction of a triplex dwelling. We have received and discussed this at previous meetings, and notice has been provided to area residents. We've received one letter of correspondence which was added to the agenda this evening, and we do have a recommendation. I'll turn to Council. Councillor Gurnett.
If it's allowed, can I ask a couple questions of staff?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Through your staff, I noticed on the bottom of the notice here that it was circulated December 19th. My question is, was this circulated by town staff through Canada Post, or was this circulated by the private person who is applying for the permit?
I'll look to staff if they're able to answer that, please.
Yes, thank
Ms.
you.
Reagan.
This was circulated through Canada Post after the mail strike was resolved.
Further to that, this is probably a question more for the corporate officer. Within our process, is our mandate met by just mailing it, or is there an expectation that they have to have received it?
No, it's just our efforts to mail it.
Okay. So I've given this some thought, and it popped in my mind the other day, and I was going to move an alternative motion to table this item until January 27th, regular council meeting, and I'll speak that if I can get a seconder.
Second for discussion.
Thank you. We have moved by Councillor Gurnett, seconded by Councillor Duck. I'll turn to the movers.
I have some concerns on this simply because of the way everything has unfolded since the strike. It's nothing to do with us per se, and we may be meeting our process by just mailing it. But based on what I've experienced and what I've spoken to my former colleagues, I think it's highly unlikely that they've received the letter. There's been an incredible backlog, and the Canada Post actually posts on their site that you can expect that the regular delivery standards will not be met and there'll be excessive delays. And I'm experiencing that myself with my own mail and other people as well. We're not getting stuff in a timely fashion. So I have concerns that although we've met the commitment, people will not have had the opportunity. We may not get any responses, but they may not have even received the letter yet. And so how can they respond to something they don't know about? So in the interest of having that process be more sound in my mind, I would prefer that there was a little bit of an extension to give them the opportunity to get the mail. That's where my position comes from.
Thank you, Councillor Gurnett. I'll turn to Councillor Duck.
Yeah, I echo my colleague's sentiments. In fact, I received a piece of mail from the town of Sidney dated November 14th, last Thursday. So that gives an indication to me of the delay that Canada Post is experiencing delivering the mail, and subsequently, if this went out in the middle of December, I doubt that most people have even seen it or even received it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Councillor Duncan.
Yeah, thank you. I understand the rationale for Councillor Garnett making this motion, especially as the concern was somebody coming back and saying that even though town sent this out at this time and met that obligation, by the fact that we knew that another government agency was not delivering the mail, that they're going to criticize that. On the other hand, I'm weighing that against the fact that doing another mail out would cost money, and that what this variance is for this application, it feels like something that just, I have trouble seeing how varying the maximum percentage of the parking area in order to allow the turnaround so that it improves traffic safety would be negatively impacting a neighbor. And that requiring that feedback from the community is something that if we didn't get it, we would be really overlooking somebody else's interest. Whereas the effect on the town of having to send it out again due to something that wasn't our fault, and on the developer and all of the contractors, they may be trying to line up to meet their deadlines as this goes through the approval process, would actually be potentially, it would be more substantial.
I'll just interject for a moment, Councillor Duncan. I believe it was not the intent of the mover to have another mailing notice.
Oh, okay.
That they were speaking to the delay with the mailing notice. I'll turn the floor back to you.
Yeah, okay, my apologies, sorry.
Thank you. Further discussion? Councillor Novak.
While I sympathize with my colleagues' concerns, I tend to agree with Councillor Duncan in that this is not the kind of variance that is likely to engender a wide response from the neighborhood. If anything, it's become necessary because of the new government legislation allowing multiple dwellings on a single property lot, and if anything, it certainly serves to our benefit to get parking off the road and onto private property. That being said, I'm not convinced that there's harm being done by the process as it now stands. So I'm not happy with delaying this any further. I think the developer would probably appreciate getting this off the table and to proceed with his development. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. For me, the point is we have this process, public notification. We're required to do it whether or not we think there's a valid reason for people to object. And so I'm in favor of the motion just because I do believe that there have been some delays by Canada Post. It may be the fact that no one else is going to submit any feedback. We may think that there's no cause for them to, but that's not for us to speculate. If we thought there was no reason to do this, doesn't matter. We're required to allow people the opportunity to provide feedback, whether we think we should or not. And so if that's the case, I think we should at least be reasonable in this circumstance to provide an appropriate amount of time. So I'll support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll pose a question through myself to staff, and that is were applicants afforded the opportunity to either have the town mail out the notices or they undertake the distribution of the notices themselves? I'll turn to Ms. Verhagen, please.
Thank you. The applicant was given the opportunity, as was the previous variance applicants that came to council before, of either having the town send the notices out through a private courier or through Canada Post. However, the strike resolved, meaning the mail started being delivered again, so the applicant chose the Canada Post route. The town would not give the applicant the option of delivering the notice themselves because of the protection of personal information due to property owners that they have to get that notice to.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for that. My comment is that we should follow a reasonable process. And it is reasonable under the circumstances to believe that the notices may not have been received by some or many of the intended recipients. Staff have followed the process, and that was the strike was complete, the strike had ended, and the notices were mailed. While I appreciate that we wouldn't turn the notices to the developer or the applicant to deliver themselves, they did have the option of engaging a courier service, which would have expedited the process. So, in these circumstances, I'm supportive of the motion. For a second time, Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have a question through you to staff. Do we have any evidence that these notices were not received by the populace at large at the date of the meeting?
Let's perhaps rephrase populace at large. It is a limited notice.
Or to that distribution.
A limited notice
yeah.
radiant.
To the target population.
Ms. Verhagen.
Thank you. Through the mayor to Councillor Novak, I can provide an anecdote that we did have somebody come into the town hall today with a notice that they did receive in the mail asking about this variance application. That's one purpose. That was one recipient. I mean, these letters go to all property owners and tenants and businesses within 75 meters or 246 feet of the subject property. So I don't recall the number offhand of how many notices went out, but we know that at least one was received because somebody came in holding the notice. But that was one person. Thank you.
Thank you. That's enough for me.
Thank you, Councillor, and to staff. Councillor Duck, for a second time.
Yeah, just to echo that, the late entry we got for mail was an email sent today based on the recipient getting a notification. So I think just giving due process, delaying it 2 weeks is not going to set anybody back too far. And I think it's appropriate given it's the perception that we're communicating. And if we demonstrate that we're doing our best to communicate, I think this is worthy of providing the time to give that communication. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've heard all perspectives, so I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Novick is opposed. The motion carries. Thank you. Next, we're turning to adoption of the minutes. If I can have a mover and seconder. Moved by Councillor Duck, seconded by Councillor Novick. Are there any corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? None are opposed. The motion carries. We're next turning to the Mayor's report. The only item on that this evening is the CRD board highlights. I don't have anything to highlight even further. I would take any questions or comments from colleagues. Otherwise, we don't require a motion to receive for information. I'm not seeing any discussion. We'll move on to the next item. We don't have any council reports this evening. We're turning to committee reports. The first under 12A is the Emergency Planning Committee meeting of September 18th. We're receiving those minutes for information. There's no motion required. There are no recommendations. Is there any discussion among council? Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And this is just a technical matter. I'm listed as being both present and absent from the meeting.
Well, make up your mind, Councillor.
As I recall, I think I wasn't there at that one.
Thank you. Those minutes will be corrected. We don't require a motion. Thank you for that. We'll turn to the next item, which is item 12B, which is the Sandwich Peninsula Accessibility Advisory Committee meeting of November 28th. We're receiving their minutes for information. We don't require a motion. There were no recommendations from the committee back to council. Is there any discussion? Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. I'll just highlight in regards to the on-street accessible parking standard, committee members provided, I think, a lot of valuable input on that standard, and the next steps will involve the standard being refined and staff committed to coming back again to SPAC to give a final review before that's finalized. So I thought it was a positive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. Seeing no further discussion, we'll move to the next item, which is 12C, the Advisory Planning Commission minutes of their meeting of January 7th. There were no recommendations. There was nothing referred by council to that committee meeting. It was their first meeting of the year. They received a presentation from staff. Is there any discussion on those minutes? Councillor Duck.
I would just like to pass on appreciation to staff for the presentation. It was well-oriented to give the new members a good understanding of what APC does. And secondly, to congratulate both Eric and Alex as being elected chair and vice chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing no further discussion, we'll move on to our next items. We're under staff reports now. We have 5 this evening. Under 13A, we have options to establish an extreme weather response shelter. We have a report from staff, and I'll turn to our Fire Chief and Emergency Management Coordinator, Chief Mickelson. Good evening.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. The November 25th regular council meeting, staff were directed to bring options back to council to establish an extreme weather response shelter. Now, this report provides pretty fulsome background information on the types of shelter programs funded by BC Housing and the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I'll turn to council if there are any questions. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you, Chief Mickelson. On page 4, when I read recognition that the number of unhoused persons in Greater Victoria continues to increase year over year must also be considered when forecasting the utilization of an EWRS in Sidney. I'm seeking a little bit of clarification on what you mean by that statement.
Sure. Through the Mayor to Councillor Garnett, as part of the research for putting this together, the CRD does their point-in-time snapshot looks at the number of homeless on a certain data, typically on 3-year intervals, and just looking at that trend, again, it's just a one-shot point-in-time data set, but it does show a continuing trend of homelessness increasing within the CRD. Therefore, I believe it's reasonable to assume that it's going to continue in Sidney as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Sorry, Councillor Keith, I did see your hand. Please go ahead.
Sure. I have a few. Just first of all, thank you to staff for earlier questions that they addressed today. But I'm still needing some help sort of understanding the different options, especially between options 1 and 2. So option number 2 to me seemed to be a little bit less cumbersome because we didn't have to go through BC Housing. But then it says that we have to exhaust all resources available through BC Housing before we can even apply to emergency management. So does that mean that we would still need to go through the BC Housing process anyways to apply for funding and then get rejected before we could go through the emergency management chain or process?
Through the Mayor to Councillor, BC Housing is the ministry responsible for the provision of shelter spaces to the unhoused in the province. So the threshold for emergency management and climate readiness to actually provide funding is there's a list there, and it's articulated in the report, is we have to exhaust all of those options that the primary ministry is responsible for before we can apply for a task number that would provide funding for a municipality, a local jurisdiction to provide that service. So it is kind of the last resort if the other in-place mechanisms to provide housing cannot be met. So it's kind of the last resort. In some ways it is easier, but the threshold is much more difficult to attain simply because we have to we have to ensure that we've exhausted all the efforts for whether it's housing in the City of Victoria, whether it's housing in Sidney. We have to actually prove a need that individuals want to access shelter. So there's this kind of large bar that we have to meet to access that funding. I hope that helps.
Yeah, sort of. Well, I kind of understood from option 1 that even if we're going to BC Housing, we still have to, identify that there's a need out in Sidney and put a plan together. But what I'm understanding is with the option 2 is we would have had to go to BC Housing first and exhaust that option before we could even consider option 2. So just want to confirm my understanding of that.
So I'm just going to try to clarify your rephrasing your question, and that is with regards to having to go to BC Housing first. I don't believe that was specifically stated in the report, but I will turn back to the chief.
Okay.
That's correct. You don't have to go to BC Housing first, but again, there's an algorithm that ideally is followed, and is the ministry responsible or the services provided would be accessed first before we just went to emergency management and climate readiness. That's kind of out of order in some ways, and the process for what we would have to do, the due diligence that we would have to do to likely be provided a BC Housing, for a task number under emergency management and climate readiness would be to confirm that our existing community and BC shelter resources are at capacity, that we have exhausted resources available through BC Housing, including extreme weather shelters, and those would likely be in the CRD. And once we have exhausted those requirements, we could contact EMBC to seek additional supports, and they would provide us with a task number and reimburse monies outlaid on a case-by-case basis. So again, accessing emergency management and climate readiness for these kind of, it's an emergency management it's kind of the last stand you have. It's not for kind of a regular provision or an anticipated provision of services. It's a last option.
Okay, I think I've got that now. So what, from the provincial government's point of view in emergency management, housing is a responsibility of BC Housing, and that's where we should be going first, is my takeaway from that, I think. The other thing this is maybe for planning staff in regards to the zoning and the OCP. So staff had indicated that there is already provision in the OCP for this, so we wouldn't need an OCP amendment. So is that for any area of the town or just for certain areas?
I'll turn to staff. Turning to Mr. Newcomb. Good evening.
Good evening. Through the Mayor to Councillor O'Keefe, that's just for the I2 zone. So the private institutional zoning, largely that's churches essentially.
Okay, thank you for that. And just a follow-up. So if, for example, we wanted to include the Shoal Center as an area that potentially could be used for a shelter, we would have to do a separate, we would have to include that in the zoning bylaw amendment as well, I presume?
It could be part of the same amending bylaw to the zoning bylaw, but it's a different zone, so it would have to be called out separately within that amending bylaw, yes.
Okay. And just one other, if I may, on the planning side of things, is would it be easier if we just granted temporary use permits for these things? Are there advantages, disadvantages, one way or the other, in just once we locate a space, whether it's I2 or a CD zone or something else, and then just have the flexibility to issue a temporary use permit as we see fit?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, the temporary use permit, the ability to issue those is authorized by the official community plan, so they have to be specifically authorized in the OCP first. And in our OCP, it only authorizes commercial and industrial temporary use permits. So unfortunately, in that case, we'd have to amend the OCP first, and then council could adopt a temporary use permit.
Okay, great. Okay, that's good for that.
I'm going to turn to I'm going to turn to Mr. Edwards.
I may need to be corrected by our planner, but in my understanding too, the use of temporary use permits is time limited, and typically they can only be renewed once before you would have to move towards a more permanent long-term solution.
Thank you. Councillor
Okay.
O'Keefe, you had the floor.
Yeah, sure. Now just getting back, I guess maybe this is a question for the chief again. In regard to the common standard mentioned for building code and fire safety, and staff previously advised today by email that you know, we would have to follow the building code and the fire code. But what I was wondering are there any specific exceptions or workarounds specific to these types of shelters? So for example, you know, they probably set up shelters for different things, say in church basements or in school gymnasiums that may not necessarily have fire suppression. So is there provision for exceptions or workarounds for emergency, temporary emergency shelters like this?
Through the mayor to Councillor O'Keefe, I would say in one word, the answer would be no. We as a local government, you know, we can't lessen requirements that are made by a provincial government in respect to the BC Fire Code or the BC Building Code. But what we can do is work with various proponents to look for, we can come up with alternative solutions. That is within our purview as long as safety is maintained. And again, I think when you talk about a church basement or something like that, we would go in and work with a building official as well as a senior fire inspector. And there's certain things that have to be there. There has to be, for someone to sleep in a building, particularly when the building was not designed for overnight occupancy, obviously there's, you know, tremendous liabilities that have to be considered. You know, there has to be exit signage, there has to be a fire safety plan, there has to be some function of a hardwired or interconnected smoke detectors that are monitored. Those are non-negotiable in provincial code. Where we can get into the BC Building Code is if we were putting some mats, for example, in a certain area of a church, that area would be, that's an A2 occupancy, and the C occupancy is where you'd be sleeping. So that's kind of BC Building Code jargon, but that would have to be separated by a 1 hour fire separation. So we would be able to work with them and hopefully identify where persons could sleep safely and still be compliant with the building code and the fire code within the building. So that we can do, but we can't, you know, look the other way for provincial fire code or building code requirements.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sure, that's great. Well, it's good to hear that there's perhaps some amount of flexibility. I guess I was concerned about if we find a location and then whoever it is, the church or the school, is required to spend tens of $1,000s on fire suppression.
Councillor O'Keefe, I'm going to interject for just a moment. Our CEO, Mr. Edwards, would like to take a moment.
Sure.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to highlight too, I don't know a lot about the new arrangement that the District of Saanich has been exploring with the United Church of Broadview. But I do know that church recently did make renovations to their facility with sheltering for cold weather events in mind. And so it's something that was pre-contemplated and planned for. And so it's not something that just sprung up in December out of nowhere. So I would like, I think Saanich and the United Church, are commended for their actions there, but I'm not sure we're in that same kind of position here.
Thank you. Councillor Keefe, I'll turn back to you.
Yeah, and just one more, actually, talking about other municipalities. I understand that Central Saanich is also looking at warming centers, and the Mr. Edwards referenced Saanich as well. There seems to be a lot of people or municipalities interested in this. So do we see ourselves maybe not necessarily collaborating, but touching base with neighboring municipalities just to find out what they're doing, getting some best practices or ideas from them? Would that be part of the process if council asked staff to move forward on this?
Mr. Edwards.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Myself and the fire chief have already met with the other peninsula municipalities on this topic to discuss the approaches there. We'll definitely can keep that line of dialogue open with all of the municipalities in the region too.
Great, thank you. That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Keefe. I have Councillor Duncan next.
Yeah, thank you. I guess a question through you to Mr. Mickelson. I guess we know that we haven't put something in place because these are usually run by NGOs that have a lot of experience in these specific areas when they're run in Victoria. And I'm just wondering about kind of the chicken and egg thing where something doesn't happen because something wasn't in place and something wasn't happening. And so knowing what the easiest way are for the town to actually court an NGO, because I think we need to be clear to the public, none of the NGOs that I am aware of who have experience in how to actually do these things and have done these things have ever come to Sidney saying that this was a location that they were interested in or that had a demand that they were aware of based on their actual service line. And also that a lot of these places, when they have to hire this very specialized staff with their requirements, have a very limited ability to do so because it is a difficult job and there are special requirements. And so the idea that we can simply snap our fingers and hire our way out of this or get different staff to do it. But what can we do that if it was an issue, simply that Sidney lacked the policy infrastructure to do this, that was within our power to do? Obviously the OCP or the I2 amendment would be one thing, but the single standard in alignment with the BC Building Code, would that be something that has been put in place in other places based on sites that were identified and then that standard was developed? Or is this something that we could front load so that we had this in place and then when an NGO, either a new one within Sidney or one from outside that had that ability, could actually see up front what we would be required and therefore what potential sites actually existed in Sidney, and potentially none do. Potentially this is something that, like in Saanich, they might have to build a specialized space for this requirement. Is this something that we could front load so that people would know that ahead of time about what the additional limitations they might need to look at would be?
Through the mayor to Councillor Duncan, and that's precisely was my intent. Okay. Looking at what the city of Surrey, which again is, you know, on a order of magnitude of scale is completely different from Sidney, but that's what they have done, is to provide an overview document to basically make it easier for proponents or NGOs or building owners to ascertain, you know, what is the feasibility of using this built form or space for this purpose, and what are the costs and what's it going to take? Is it suitable? So that's precisely, and that's something like I mentioned in the report that's within our scope and our abilities. We could do, again, to front load, to provide a fairly simplistic yet comprehensive document to make it easier for those individuals to make that an informed choice.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Further questions? One question I had through myself to staff is with regards to warming shelter and the application through emergency management. It indicates that that staff would be staff with appropriate training would be involved, and that's under option 2. Is it not a consideration to have an NGO in that situation because it's considered a last a last option, as was described earlier.
So, sort of just clarifying, Mr. Mayor, that you're saying that if we pursued option 2 under the, that's if we go option 2 and independently open a extreme weather shelter that's funded by emergency management and climate readiness. Under those circumstances, if we did that, we would try to hire or procure the staff required, and then would ideally would try to push that bill under the task number to be reimbursed by emergency management and climate readiness. That would be our process.
Okay, so whereas option 1 involves an NGO, option 2, that's not a consideration.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I realize it still does, option 2 does still likely require a partnership with a third party for the premises, but not for the operation. Okay.
Yeah, I would just clarify, and again, speaking to other municipalities, it's so specific to each jurisdiction. For example, we don't have our municipally owned rec center or type of facility that we could look at. That is definitely a driver in many municipalities. Obviously, comparing again us to Saanich or Victoria is kind of an apples to oranges from a capacity and ability. But nevertheless, our owned or accessible built form is a driver of what we can do as well. So I just want to highlight that.
We've certainly heard, council members, members of the public, and staff have certainly heard things in the media with regards to emergency weather response shelters elsewhere in the region. From what I've heard in the media, but I would ask for staff if they are aware that in the few other municipalities that do have shelters, that they are all involved NGOs, and that to the best of our knowledge there is no community on the South Island that we're aware of in the regional district where the municipality is operating, municipal staff are operating the warming shelter or involved in an emergency weather response shelter.
That's correct.
Okay.
Do you have?
Mr. Mayor, I do believe that there are municipalities that do provide warming shelters, which is not the same as an emergency weather response shelter.
Mm-hmm.
But that they will provide warming shelters within municipally owned facilities with municipal staffing support.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Chief Mickelson?
Yeah, and again, to echo Mr. Edwards' comments, the City of Victoria would be a classic example. They stand up warming centers, but again, that is when their existing BC housing temporary warming shelters and extreme weather response shelters are at capacity. Then they've met, again, that threshold where they're at capacity, and then they're in a position to go to emergency management and climate readiness and say, our resources are completely, they're at 100%. We would like a task number to open up one of these facilities, and then they'll be reimbursed for that.
Thank you. Councillor, Council, I'm not seeing any further discussion. Oh, Councillor O'Keefe, go ahead.
Thank you. Just going back to option 1 again, just wanting to confirm my understanding that the town isn't looking to operate one of these, but that staff would be seeking out NGOs who might be interested in providing the support, and then putting in some of these measures or contributing as outlined in the report.
That's correct.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Councillor Novak.
So I'd like to make a motion from this that we ask staff to pursue option 1 with regards to an emergency weather response shelter and report back to council on the results of their efforts within 30 days.
So thank you. Before I seek a seconder, I'll seek clarification on the motion, and that is given the time of year it is right now, relative to the winter season. The expectation is that we could be considering option 1 for the 2025 winter season, or are you willing to specify direction as to whether it would either be that or be the 25-26 winter season?
I think it could be done for this year. We heard tonight that there are organizations, NGOs, that would be willing to cooperate with us.
Sorry.
So I think it's feasible to do it for this year. But the purpose of the motion would be to ask staff to pursue it and report back to us to see that it is in fact feasible for this year. If not, then for future years.
Okay, so I'm going to,
Maybe
before
we
I seek
need
a
more
seconder to the motion,
precision.
again, to clarify or to seek information from staff, in terms of the last part of motion for staff to return in 30 days, is that feasible?
It's entirely feasible for us to return in 30 days. I don't know that we'll have much more to report on. I would like to better understand what organizations came forward this evening offering their willingness to take a leadership role in this vein. We would, to pursue option 1, I think, which is a good option, worth considering, but just to be absolutely clear, will still require a significant amount of staff time, predominantly from our fire chief, who's our emergency program coordinator, because we don't have a full-time designated emergency program coordinator, and that we do need to secure an NGO that's willing to take the lead on operations and management of the facility, and we need to find a facility as well. So I do believe we could, if council wished us to pursue that option, we could initiate those types of discussions and that type of research. I would be cautious about how much information we'd be bringing back in 30 days. I just would want to manage expectations, because I'm not sure that we would have made significant ground in that time.
Councillor Novick, if you...
I don't know how better to phrase this. I think we need to get the ball rolling, and I hesitate.
I'm not seeking motivation at this point, Councillor. I appreciate what you're saying. I just sought clarification. So clarification is to pursue option 1 and to for staff to return to council in 30 days.
Within 30 days.
Within 30 days. Thank you. I will seek a seconder. Okay, I'm not seeing a seconder on the motion. Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I would like to move to alternate motions. If I may, I would introduce them both and then seek your for seconders separately.
Sure.
So their bullet points from option 1, which I will not move in its entirety, because I think I read a different report. But I would move that bullet 1 in that list there, to present council with a text amendment to the OCP in the I2 institutional zone for consideration to permit temporary sheltering resulting from extreme weather events, be moved to, I guess, the zoning bylaw amendments that staff are currently doing, put into that package, so that all of those amendments are done at once. And the second bullet, which is to provide the single standard in alignment with the British Columbia Building Code and British Columbia Fire Code to ensure a safe environment for temporary sheltering. And the discussion of that task may move to the strategic plan, so we can hear from staff when they would have the capacity to do that. So,
sorry, I'm going to seek clarification, and then staff wishes to address. So I understand you're moving the first bullet and the second bullet.
Yeah.
And then a third bullet is referring.
No, those are just those are the 2 bullets. But the first one, I am moving. Sorry, I did it sloppily. So the first bullet, I'm moving to the zoning bylaw updates that are being done this year, to have that moved into that. And the second bullet, I'm moving that as an item to the strategic plan discussions. Those are 2 motions, yeah.
So the second bullet, you are moving it to refer to strategic planning?
Yes.
Do you have any other motions following that?
Nope.
Okay. So I'm going to turn to Ms. Verhagen first. We don't have a seconder. I'm not seeking a seconder yet.
No, thank you. Just through the mayor to clarify, there is a slight typo in that first line there. It should say present council with a text amendment to the zoning bylaw in the institutional zone, not to the OCP. So, sorry.
Yes,
But
thank
you
you.
are
That
on
makes
the
it
right
even
track
clearer.
with referring it to the zoning bylaw amendment, so thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I think they should be. I think this should be separated. The reason I asked the question as to whether there would be any further motions is that we could proceed with those. We could have a seconder, we could discussion, we could pass them, but are we? We're doing that, but that doesn't start a process for either an emergency weather response shelter or a warming center.
Yes, thank you. And I wish to be clear that it is not my intention to trigger with this the creation of that, because the report I read seems to suggest that we have neither the demand for that under our existing regulations,
Okay.
nor like in terms of the actual emergency volume in Sidney. So this is just to front load that if that should arise, or should an NGO step forward, we have done our diligence, but I'm not intending to trigger a process that at this point.
Okay, you provide the clarification, I think, and I will turn to Mr. Newcomb, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to provide a little context on the zoning as well. So to make a zoning change that would allow for a shelter like that, obviously it's dependent on the site, and the institutional zone does allow for something like that without an OCP amendment, but if there's another site that becomes available that's got a different OCP or zoning amendment, a broader change to either of those documents might be necessary. So it's somewhat interdependent, that the site and the zoning obviously are connected, and depending on the site, a different level of zoning change might be necessary. So without knowing a specific site, we could make an assumption that it would be maybe a church under the I2 zone, but without knowing the exact site, can't say for certain the level of zoning or OCP change that might be necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is for before seeking a seconder, seeking clarification on the first motion, on the first bullet. And that is, it's referring to I2 institutional zone. However, we've, through questions that council members had through to staff previous to the meeting, we understand that the Shoal Center, for example, is not an I2 zone. It's a comprehensive development zone. So this motion doesn't necessarily cover amending the zone for the Shoal Center. I'm seeing nods from staff. Do you want to consider that, Councillor Duncan?
Yeah, if staff think that's a simple change within the same, I'm worried that if it adds that it ends up making a different process, but as long as that's not something that then triggers.
We'll turn to Mr. Newcomb for.
Thank you. I guess one way to think about it is similar to a development application where the use is proposed and then the zoning change is made. That's the typical sort of order of things. It's pretty atypical that we would make a broad zoning change and then sort of try to plug the use in after the fact.
Yeah.
So knowing the use and its location beforehand, before working on a zoning amendment would be the ideal situation.
So it sounds like to me that the I2 is a simple word addition to that, whereas going to the CD would be a different process. So I wouldn't add that to this motion, but if somebody wants to move that later with specific zones and how they want to do that, they're free to do so.
Okay, just for clarification, if the motion, we leave the wording as you've proposed, then if for some reason an NGO came forward and was proposing the Shoal Center, then it would require a process for a separate amendment through council. That's fine. Do we have a seconder for that first motion from Councillor Duncan?
Second for discussion.
Councillor Duck, I'll turn to the movers for any further.
No, I think, well, I guess I can. That just looking at this report and looking what we can actually do with the staff that's available and with the capacities we have and what's within our purview as a policy group with the experiences our staff have, and what we know about the operating environment that we have, our jurisdiction, I think this is one of the things that we can easily do within the package of work that's going on. That, you know, this is something that takes, according to emails I'd had with staff, you know, a month and a half, and is something that very simply enables the groups that have told us they're very concerned about this to begin looking at their spaces, which is obviously, as we've been instructed by the public and asked from other municipalities to do, is look at what we have available. And we've heard that other municipalities are partnering with churches, and so I see this as the most obvious thing that we can do to start moving that process along.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll turn to the seconder.
Yes, if I can, a question through to staff, and just from the preamble we had on the discussion of this motion, is it the intent that staff are seeing that this kind of text going into the zoning bylaw? Just from the preamble you gave, sort of an indication that may be part of the amendments you'll be making to the bylaw.
I think the original zoning bylaw amendments that were contemplated for 2025 were strictly limited to housing supply issues as required by the province through the recent legislative amendments. However, if council wishes, we can add this to that process too.
So the information I'm receiving, though, is that this is merely a technical addition to an existing bylaw, so it's additional wording. It's not anything great.
Correct.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. I then will support this motion moving forward.
Thank you. I have Councillor O'Keefe and Councillor Novick.
Thank you. I'm not in support of the motion for a number of reasons. First of all, it doesn't, if the intention, it sounds like the intention of the motion is we're just going to put some zoning in place and then sit back and hope that NGOs or somebody else will come along. I don't think we're going to get very far ahead. I'm more in favor of allowing staff to move forward with everything that's in option 1, because I think that's the only way we're going to get traction on it. In terms of comments made that suggesting that there's not a need demonstrated for this and let NGOs come forward.
Okay, Councillor O'Keefe, I'm just going to interject for a moment, and I don't think it's appropriate to motivate on all of option 1 when we have just one item, one segment from that. You've indicated why you're not supportive, but I think motivating on option 1 in its entirety is not appropriate at this time.
Okay, the other issue I have with the wording for the first bullet is I appreciate staff's earlier comments about once they go out and do some investigation, they might find perhaps a shoal center or other places, and comments that perhaps a more broader wording would be provided or preferred in the zoning bylaw. And so I don't find that what we're proposing here is very useful and going to move us ahead at all. So I'm not in favor. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll turn to Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree with Councillor O'Keefe. I don't see that this is going to move the process forward. I paid special attention to what Mr. Newcomb said when he said that it makes a lot more sense to find the situation that we want to turn into an emergency weather response shelter, and then once we have the ducks in a row, we come to council with all the appropriate or necessary amendments at that time. I'm not sure that passing this right now and trying to create some kind of a catch-all bylaw amendment is going to be useful to us in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before going to Councillor Duncan for a second time, I have a question through the staff, and that is, I believe our understanding of the process for the I2 zoning amendment is because it's consistent with the OCP, it doesn't require a public hearing. So it could happen quite quickly. to come to council if, as Mr. Newcomb mentioned earlier, a particular applicant at a particular location came forward with a proposal, then council would be able to deal with it in a relatively quick period of time. Thank you. So I will motivate. I don't see the purpose of doing this. I don't want to build false hope in terms of us passing this motion and that it's somehow interpreted that we're actually moving a shelter forward in some respect. A zoning amendment can be done very quickly because it's consistent with the OCP and doesn't require a public hearing. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan for a second time.
So to be clear, I moved this because it was actually something staff suggested that they could do very quickly. And I was just told that this motion is no good because it's not quick enough at putting in place a process that would take, as Mr. Newcomb, and perhaps I'm the one who misheard what he said, would say would actually require an OCP amendment with the community engagement and all of the extra stuff that would require. So I'm told that this is not something we should put in place because it isn't going to include all the other stuff that would take too long. Therefore, we're not going to vote it in because it's not moving the process along fast enough. I'm just going to say, if people are wondering why we have an emergency, there it is.
Any further discussion? I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor O'Keefe, Councillor Novak, myself, the motion is defeated. It did not pass with a tie vote. Sorry, Councillor O'Keefe, I do recognize your hand, but Councillor Duncan had a second motion she wished to bring forward.
It's irrelevant now. There's no place in town that is zoned for this, and I don't think there's a purpose with doing this unless, as many people have pointed out, we first identify a place that will require this to be done.
Councillor O'Keefe?
Thank you. So I'd like to move that staff move forward with option 1 and to have a plan in place for emergency shelter for the 2025-2026 winter season. So that would be, I believe that's sometime starting in the end of this year, the end of 2025, and then into 26. And I would change bullet 1 that to be more broad, just to read, present council with a text amendment, or to present council with relevant text amendments to the OCP and zoning bylaw for consideration to permit temporary sheltering resulting from extreme weather events. So I'm just removing the specificity of the I2 to address the issue that staff mentioned earlier, that it might be better to identify a place first, and then they could come forward with the appropriate amendments that be needed.
Okay, so just for clarity for all members of council, you're moving option 1 in its entirety, and you're amending the first bullet, removing the I2 zone, but making reference to appropriate text amendments to the OCP and zoning bylaw.
Right, and then I just added that it was to be in place for the winter season for 2025, 2026.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have it moved and seconded. Before going to motivation, I'll turn to Mr. Edwards, please.
I'm not trying to be obstructionist here by any stretch of the imagination, but I just want to remind council that this is predicated on staff being able to find willing partners and a facility that would be acceptable. And so while I think it may well be achievable, I just want to make sure that council understands that it's not entirely within our control.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use the term "it's not guaranteed." I'm given that this option says to find a partner. It's not guaranteed. So I will ask you to repeat, or perhaps Ms. Nelson, to repeat the latter part of the motion, the last part of the motion with regards to implementation, or how it comes back.
Okay, this is what I've got out of the motion. The first one is that staff move forward with option 1 and to have a plan in place for emergency shelter for the 2025-2026 winter season, and that we present council with relevant OCP and zoning bylaw amendments to permit temporary sheltering for extreme weather events. Those are the two that I have, unless there's an error in there.
Sorry,
No,
I just seeking again, just the piece of wording with regards to have, it says to have a plan in place? Okay. I'm going to turn back to the mover. I have some concern with having a plan in place when we can't say that we're going to have a plan in place because it's contingent on external factors. I'll turn back to you, Councillor O'Keefe.
I'm happy to say to endeavor to have a plan in place, if that's better. I mean, I totally expect that staff are going to make their best efforts to put something in place, and I acknowledge Mr. Edwards' comments about, you know, some of these things are out of our control in terms of finding an NGO. And I would presume that if staff, with their best efforts, weren't able to get this in place, they'll be coming back to us in the fall or prior to the winter to update us on that. So if that makes it easier to say that endeavor to have in place,
I'm just thinking on the fly here, Councillor, I might offer the suggestion of pursue a plan.
Sure, I'm fine with that.
Okay. The seconder agrees with that? Okay. So that, we have that correction. So we haven't moved and seconded. I will turn to the mover and seconder for motivation. Further motivation.
So I'll just start by saying, in terms of, there's some comments, perhaps in terms of whether there is a need for this or not. There were comments made about no NGOs have been out here to offer a service, therefore there must not be a need. I mean, we had our local pastor from St. Andrew's Church speak before us tonight. They also came forward last year in 2023, identifying that there is a need for this. So I'm satisfied that there's a need to do that. I think we have an obligation to do it in terms of the different options available. I think this is the best one. It involves us, the town, demonstrating some leadership in being the convener or marshalling resources to find out who's available, what premises are available, NGOs available to help pull something together for our community. So I think it's the best option available under the circumstances. That's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Novick is the seconder.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I support this because there's an expectation in the community that we do something along these lines, and it is for that reason that this has appeared on the agenda. It has come up in discussion. It is something that most municipalities have to contend with at some time or another. And notwithstanding the fact that we are a small municipality with limited resources, I do believe that we at least owe our community the effort to try and come up with a reasonable solution to this problem. It's a problem that's not of our making, it's true, but it has always been the mark of a civilized community as to how it treats those less fortunate. And I would not like it be said that Sidney simply ignored the problem or chose option 4 and decided to do nothing. I accept the fact that staff will be putting forth their best efforts and that they will pursue it, but I understand that there's no guarantee of success, that it does involve outside agencies. But I do believe that the community, in supporting this, will somehow help this come together, and we will see a positive outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. I'll turn to Councillor Duck.
Thank you, Mayor. I will not be supporting this motion because I don't think, I think it should be going to strategic planning to identify the priority we give to it relative to all the other priorities we have and the funds we have available for the entire community. As has been defined, the need is not high demand. You know, we're looking at potentially 24 people within a population of 12,000. And I recognize that we should be taking care of those people. We do have organizations that are providing some support to that, of which we heard tonight and they spoke, but we have not had organizations come forward to say they will also extend to support the development of an EWR. And I'm cognizant of the fact that we have a lot of priorities on our plate, and I think this should go to strategic planning to give some direction to staff as to what the priority weight is on this to do it. And so I won't support this as an independent motion, but will support something going to strategic planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'll turn to staff for a point of clarification, and that is reference was made to up to 24 individuals that are homeless. From previous information that's come to council, that number has been closer to 12, if staff could clarify.
That's my understanding, that it's closer to 12.
Okay, just for clarity. Thank you. I'll turn to Councillor Gurnett next, please.
Thank you, Mayor. I will support the recommendation, and I'm not going to speak to points already made by my colleagues, but I just go back to the question I asked of Chief Mickelson, and the thought that this isn't going to lessen, it's going to grow. So we're likely to have, this is likely to expand in all the communities in CRD, ours included. So I think we do need to have something, at least pursuing something, so we'll be able to be in a position where we can effectively deal with the situation should it rise and we need it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gurnett. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I'll be voting against this. I believe that one of the main things that communities deserve from elected officials and their staff is truth and honesty. Our staff were honest about their capacities. They were honest about the order of operations and the way where they operate. We know that our staff are already over capacity. They've given us an indication of the limitations, and they've said over and over in the report, you know, our RCMP, our emergency staff, are also in contact with the unhoused population. They also know them by name. They also know the limitations of how staff have and how organizations have to deal with specifically this issue. I understand that anyone can come to council and assert that they believe that we should be able to do it, but we also have to respect that they might not know what they're talking about, and they might merely have a strong feeling about it. And if they're really, truly, honestly willing to do something about it, then putting these things in place to enable them to work with us would have done that. Saying it's all of our jobs to do, all of our staff's jobs to do, I'm not interested in lying to the community about where we're gonna get with that, which is that this is something to make it look like we're doing something because we can't bear the pressure of having people feel desperate and having people see a problem and feel helpless about it. We have to just bear that. We have to bear that this was a problem that took decades of willful neglect and intentional, you know, measures in the real estate market to make housing unaffordable for people. And it's gonna take decades to fix, and merely committing to do things that our staff have told us are not actually lined up to do isn't being truthful with the community, and I think we owe them more than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. I'm going to move a motion to refer this to our next council meeting. We have 6 council members. We've had one motion fail tonight on a tie vote. I feel the importance of this is we should have all members of council speak to this.
Second.
So I do have it seconded. Any discussion? I've given my very brief motivation while making the motion. I apologize for not seeking a seconder first. I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you. We're next turning to,
Point of order.
I'll call a recess for 10 minutes, please. We'll resume at 8:20.
Safe?
We'll reconvene our meeting. Thank you. And we're now turning to item 13B, which is potential amendments to surplus policy FN-012. And I'll turn to Mr. Hisik for an introduction, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the status of the town's accumulated surplus has been discussed over the past few budget cycles, and during last year's process, staff committed to reporting back on a review of our current policy. The report on this agenda provides some background information and discusses potential strategies as we're about to embark on our 2025 budget process. The staff report outlines that what we mean by the term surplus and how it was generated over the years. And this surplus discussion is linked to our budget process because of our long-standing practice of balancing our budget by using an appropriation of surplus each year. We do that to prevent overtaxing our residents, and based on the premise that in a typical year, we will likely be able to realize some savings within our operations. Unfortunately, the years since the pandemic have not been typical, and that's the main reason we find ourselves having to reconsider our surplus policy at this time. So that long-standing policy defines a minimum level of surplus as 25% of our municipal property tax revenues. And the table in the report shows that since the end of 2022, we've fallen below that minimum level. And that's due mostly to the effects of the pandemic, as previously stated. And first, it was the tax cuts that we enacted in 2020, and then the reliance on the Safe Restart grant to make up for those lost revenues. And finally, the high inflation that seems to be linked to the supply chain disruptions since COVID. We've continued to face cost pressures of the past 5 budget cycles, and now our Safe Restart cushion has run out. We need to raise our tax revenues to a more sustainable level and rebuild our surplus balance over the next several years. Staff are recommending that we continue to use surplus to mitigate cost impacts for the upcoming year, but that a year from now we bring forward a plan to gradually get back above policy levels. It's always a balancing act between the short term of keeping taxes lower and the long term of being financially sustainable. Input from Council tonight or through the upcoming budget process will be useful in navigating this policy decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hisik. I'll turn to colleagues if there are any questions. Now, I do want to pause for a moment and see if Councillor O'Keefe has rejoined the meeting. I did indicate we wouldn't be starting for a couple of minutes.
Oh, sorry, I was here sitting with my video off, but I'm here.
We're all good. It was my fault for not checking first. Thank you. I'll turn to colleagues. Are there any questions from the staff report? Councillor Novick.
Thank you. I appreciate the report, and I'm also of the opinion that that surplus funds should be limited to extraordinary expenses. My question is, the second of recommendations says a revised surplus policy be brought forward for consideration by the end of 2026. However, when I look at the existing surplus policy, it does say acceptable levels of surplus for general operating fund are 25 to 50% of municipal property taxes. Could you give us a sense of where you'd like to go with that policy if it's going to be substantially different from what we already have?
Thank you, Councillor. I've tried to intimate in my report that I believe 25% is far more realistic based on the best practices research. Seems to be linked to 2 months of operating expenditures, and when you do the calculation on that, it's very close to 25% of our revenues. So I feel like that's a reasonable upper limit for us. So when I do bring back a revised policy, I'm more likely to focus on the lower end of our current policy threshold and not the higher end, if that helps.
But since we're already there, since we already have that number there, why would you change it? It does give you a lot more latitude should circumstances change in a given year or in a given series of years?
I'm not sure that I'd be recommending major changes to the thresholds. I think changes to our policy are more likely to just beef up the wording and just provide some more parameters for under circumstances that it can be used, and perhaps a bit more guidance on what we do should we ever fall below policy levels again. I think those will be the focus of proposed amendments, and not so much whether it's going to be 25, 50, or some other number.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novick, and my question through to staff is that, partly based on the last question, is that part of the policy, revised surplus policy being brought forward next year, if we were to pass this recommendation, is a replenishment recommendation as well. So.
Sorry, that was a statement or?
Well, it's. I'm trying to phrase it as a question.
Okay.
That next year you would bring, if we were still at 17% or below the 25%, you would perhaps be bringing back a replenishment policy, or not necessarily a formal policy, but a plan approved by council.
That is the intention. Is for the 2026 budget year, I would be coming back roughly 12 months from now with recommendations for replenishment, but likely following up on that on a revised policy at a later date based on the outcome of the 2026 budget.
Okay, well, that's helpful. Thank you. Councillor Duck?
I'm prepared to move the recommendation.
Please.
And I so move that council provide in principle the ongoing use of surplus to mitigate near-term tax impacts, and 2, that a revised surplus policy be brought forward for consideration by the end of 2026.
Second.
Moved and seconded. I'll turn to the movers.
Yeah, I think that certainly staff have demonstrated good fiscal management using this policy over the past few years, and I think it's wise to update it and bring it current, and certainly to get back to those levels. I think our taxpayers would appreciate the fact that how well the surplus has helped keep our tax rates down, and I think they would want to see that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Gurnett?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Hisik, for the report and for the work. It's very important going forward. From my perspective, in the report you mentioned, and as we've had discussions like this before, I prefer the conservative approach and would like to get that surplus back to where I'm comfortable and you're comfortable as quickly as possible. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that we have many residents and taxpayers in our community that are still struggling with the cost of living issues that are going on throughout our country, and our community is no exception. So keeping that in mind, I think the plan you put forward here is the way to go forward, and it also gives people more time to get the information and to understand what's coming ahead, and to be able to digest it and actually provide feedback on top of that. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favour? That carries unanimous. Thank you. We're now turning to 13C, which is Council Procedure Bylaw Review Policy. I'll turn to Ms. Nelson, please, for an introduction.
Thank you. This report is to address Council's strategic priority under organizational excellence with respect to the establishment of a Council Procedure Bylaw Review Policy. Staff are recommending that the review of the procedure bylaw be completed in the second year of a new council's term. This allows new officials at the start of their term to understand the current bylaw provisions and meeting protocols before implementing any changes. With 2025 being the third year of this council's term, staff suggests that should a member wish to amend a particular section in the bylaw, to submit a notice of motion for council's consideration. Staff at this time don't have any recommendations for amendments. And yes, I would be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. Are there any questions on the staff report?
I'll move the recommendation.
Please.
All right. That policy CC 011, Council Procedure Bylaw Review, be approved.
I'll second.
It's moved by Councillor Duncan, second by Councillor Novick. Any motivation?
I don't think any is needed.
Councillor Novick? Seeing no other discussion, I'll call the question. All in favour? That carries unanimous. Thank you for bringing that forward. We're next looking at item 13D, initiating the hiring of a second deputy fire chief. We'll turn to Chief Mickelson, please.
Good evening again. This report requests that Council advance the hire of the second career deputy fire chief that's already provided for in the 2025 budget. At present, our organization is structured to operate with 3 exempt chiefs, and we're just operating with 1, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions from Council? Councillor Duck?
Yeah, if I may, through to staff. Chief, do we have any candidates within the current staff that may move up to this position?
I would say there are some qualified staff within our volunteer cohort and career cohort at this time, but an exempt position like this would definitely be, we would explore opportunities outside.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to staff, and this would be to Mr. Hissick. The $150,000, that would be approximately what percentage of the budget?
Sorry, a tax increase?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a hair over 1%.
Thank you.
Seeing no further questions, we have a recommendation. Councillor Duncan?
That an immediate posting for the recruitment of a second deputy fire chief be approved.
I'll second.
Moved and seconded by Councillor Novick. Any motivation?
I think the report speaks for itself. We're almost past time to do this, so thanks.
Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. I struggled with this one with one specific reason, and 3 weeks from tonight we'll be presented with the budget. And this, as I just asked, is just over 1% increase to the tax. And yes, it is a supplemental item that already was in the 5-year plan budget. But there's no guarantees the supplemental request will be approved come budget time. That discussion takes place when we're looking at the overall budget. And the problem I'm having here is I don't have the overall budget to compare it to. I don't have the context of that. And so I don't know. And I look back at the statement on the report on 13B where it says extraordinary budget pressures and why we wouldn't want to do tax increases this year. And then it says that will not be 2025. So I'm anticipating 2025 will have budget pressures. And I'm fearful that the numbers are going to be high. And if we lock ourselves into something now, what room do we have to maneuver when we actually get to discussions? If I knew what we were facing and this request came forward, then that's a different scenario. But because I'm totally in the blind here, I'm just not comfortable with it, not knowing those numbers. The rationale is solid, and I understand where it's coming from, and I think I'm not disagreeing with the need. Yeah, I'm just not sure, given the overall context of the budget, if I'd be comfortable with it. So doing it in advance without knowing, I can't do that, so I won't support the recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gannett.
I'm sorry. I moved it. I didn't motivate. Oh, no, yes, I did. I'm sorry. I was just thinking of responses to Councillor Gar.
I'll just motivate briefly. I think, sorry, Councillor Keefe, did you have your hand raised?
Yes.
Please go ahead before myself.
Sure. I had similar concerns as Councillor Garnett in terms of, well, that's, 1% tax increase and not being able to weigh that against other things that may be coming forward. However, having said that, I'm comfortable that this is something that there is a need for. It's something that is focused on providing, saving people's lives and putting out fires and emergency management. I think it's something critical. So although there's a cost to it, I can't see at budget time that I would say no to this increase in favor of something else. So like Councillor Garnett, I'm concerned about the tax increase, but if it's something that we seem to definitely need, I think we should go forward with it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. Okay, Councillor Novick.
Thank you. I seconded the motion because I am a firm believer in having a robust fire and community safety organization. I think that the need for having these services, even in a small community like ours, is only going to grow. With climate change, with homeless problems that are far from being solved or resolved, I think having a robust emergency management program as well as a strong fire department is essential. I think that's one of the few things that most residents would not hesitate to support, even if it did mean another 1% to their tax bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. I'll motivate very briefly. This has been in our financial plan for 2 or 3 years. There were other additions to the fire department in the two previous years. We understood from staff when they presented the plan for the changes over 3 years what the importance was to our core service that we provide in the community. The fact that staff has brought this forward 6 or 8 weeks in advance of our budget approval signals the high priority that staff feel in providing this core service in our community. And while there will be budget pressures, we had budget pressures last year, and I see no reason why we won't have budget pressures this year. But we understand the priority that staff have made this. We understand that it's been in the plan for 3 years, and I'm fully supportive of it going forward now. Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I was acknowledging I already motivated. I'd like to speak for a second time just to address, because it's a matter of public record and the issue of budget, and that we're not seeing the impacts on the budget before we are approving this, and that might potentially have in some way influenced our decision. That again, we've just discussed a report and moving forward on some work where we don't currently have staff for. But that report was written by Chief Mickelson, who is also an active firefighter. And all of the work that would have had to be done there would have been probably overseen by him and people under his staff. So I think it's really important when we talk about budget implications and improving things and scopes of work before it would go forward, that when we are discussing something that, as the mayor's pointed out, has been in the plans for some time and has a known caseload and a known work description, known reporting, known, that it's within our existing service line, that a 1% property tax increase, is something we need to weigh. It certainly is. But to say that we might have, had to discuss that further when we were not willing to discuss further, and we thought it was an emergency to move forward on something outside of scope that would have added to that staff and that staff's load, while then saying that we might not even consider that staff, is worth the 1% property, I find this really an alarming discussion. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll just remind Council that when we're speaking, we should be speaking to the motion and not necessarily speaking to the remarks from other councillors. Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favour? Opposed? Councillor Gurnett is opposed. The motion carries. Thank you. We're now moving to item 13E, which is Next Generation 911 Implementation and Operation Contract. Chief Mickelson, we'll turn to you one more time, please.
Yes, this report requests Council's approval to enter into a bilateral agreement with the CRD to facilitate the implementation of the upcoming Next Gen 911 system. And again, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions from staff? I'll turn to Councillor Gannett to begin.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm just seeking a little clarification given the next item on the agenda, 14A. Does approving this agreement have any impact at all on the downloading the police dispatch costs, or is it completely separate?
Completely separate.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. Councillor Novick.
I'm prepared to make the recommendation.
Please.
I move that the agreement with the CRD to facilitate the implementation of Next Gen 911 be approved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favour? That carries unanimous. Thank you. We're now turning to our two items of correspondence. The first is 14A, which is downloading of police dispatch costs. We have both a letter from the Ministry of Public Safety dated December 5th to the mayors, to the 10 South Island mayors, including Sidney. And we have a joint letter from those 10 South Island municipalities dated December 16th back to the minister. And this is for information. So I will turn to council if there are any questions with regards to the contents of these two letters. I can say, and I think it would be helpful to council to provide a recent update, and that is we're the 10 South Island mayors working with their CAOs and CFOs have drafted a further response letter. It's in the draft stage now to the new minister after the election, and it is requesting, among other things, the same in this meeting, in this letter, but also requesting a meeting with the new minister. I'll turn to colleagues if there's any questions. Councillor Gurnett.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm not sure who's going to be able to answer this. So the federal component has been taken away. So I'm just wondering if at some time during the process, if they have discussed the rationale for why they've chosen the 10 South Island municipalities as opposed to everybody.
I'll turn to Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mayor. Essentially, the federal government enters into agreement with every province that they provide RCMP services through. There's two agreements with the province of BC, one for providing provincial policing and one for municipal policing. And in that agreement, the federal government makes it clear that, well, it isn't really clear, it's a bit opaque, that the provision of dispatch services are not funded federally if that service is provided by a third-party corporation. And so when the provincial government and our member or neighboring municipalities entered into discussions about consolidating dispatch services into one service provider, the idea of using e-com was brought forward. E-com was already in use in the Lower Mainland by the Lower Mainland municipalities. However, at that time, it was not made clear to the municipalities, our 10 South Island municipalities, that the funding from the federal government would be withdrawn. Those discussions carried on with the understanding that the existing funding arrangement of the federal government and the provincial government covering off all of the dispatch costs would remain in effect. And so it wasn't until later, until after a decision was made to pursue working with e-com to provide those dispatch services, that the federal government identified that they would withdraw their funding. And then by that same token, the province said if the federal government is not providing funding, we also will withdraw our funding. I hope, does that answer your question?
So it's complicated.
Yeah.
Sorry, was Mr. Hizik wanting to no? So do we have any recourse of any kind if they go ahead with this full force?
We have been trying, and so ever since it was brought to our attention that the funding would not be provided, the 10 municipalities have been lobbying the province for a remedy. The province did come forward with some transitional funding which expires effective immediately. So in this budget year, 2025, the 10 municipalities will be on the hook for financing the dispatch costs to the tune of about $4.5 million. And so we're continuing to lobby the provincial government to maintain that transitional funding until there can be a more equitable solution. And the remainder of the province is served by dispatch services that are funded by the federal and provincial governments, except for the Lower Mainland who receives the service through e-com.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Okay, seeing no further discussion, we'll move to the next item, and I will turn to Councillor O'Keefe, who raised the letters with regards to the Bower Bank bikeway. Councillor O'Keefe.
Sure, thank you, Mayor. So as we know, we've received a number of emails from citizens on this. In tonight's agenda, we had several in December as well. I know there's been a lot of comments on social media, and you know, I've heard a lot from my neighbors. I live in the area. I've lived in proximity to the Bower Bank corridor for 26 years. My kids traveled to and from to Sidney Elementary School and North Saanich, so I'm familiar with the area. Anyways, I think it's important for council to firstly thank citizens for taking the time to provide the feedback and to give them some sense of how we might plan to proceed on this. I want to acknowledge that staff did a lot in terms of engaging the public on the transportation plan, active transportation plan. Back in 2023, there was surveys, there was pop-ups, there was open houses, there was a lot on social media, town talk, newsletters, that sort of thing. In regard to Bower Bank specifically, when council first reviewed the plan in 2023, Bower Bank wasn't initially a priority, and the design of what it would look like wasn't completely certain at that time. Despite that, council did authorize staff to move ahead with the design, and we also authorized them to proceed with construction. Last October, we looked at Bower Bank again when staff wanted us to approve a grant for the project. So there's been a lot of talk about Bower Bank at the council table. However, in retrospect, perhaps council should have inserted somewhere along the line an element that involved reaching out specifically to residents earlier along and adjacent to the Bower Bank corridor with the details of the design and solicit their feedback. Yeah, I think it's notable that, you know, we've done that. So, you know, just at the end of last year, staff did start raising awareness about what was going on there. And when people start to know what is actually going on in their neighborhood, then they've come forward with feedback. And I think they've raised some good points and maybe some things that we hadn't considered before. So the question is, for us, do we just dismiss that feedback and say that, well, it's too bad they missed the boat, they should have provided it sooner? Or do we take the time to consider whether we need to make adjustments on the project? Along with that, I'm reflecting on some of the original goals for wanting to put resources into active transportation. So we wanted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by encouraging more people to cycle, and we wanted to have safer roads. However, when I look at some of the feedback, it has me questioning whether this project will actually contribute to those. So for example, I'm looking at, you know, if we've got hundreds of residents who are going to need to drive more kilometers a day to and from their residence, that seems to be counterproductive to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. While Bower Bank may end up being a quieter road, that won't be the case on the smaller roads. Like, it's going to involve more traffic being funneled down Amelia, for example.
Point of order, we discussed all of this very robustly when we did this, and we did a traffic study associated with this.
Sorry, Councillor, first, Councillor Duncan, I'll recognize your point of order. I'll recognize you to provide the point of order, and then I'll rule on the point of order. Your point of order is?
Just that I don't see the point in bringing up information that is asking questions that we already answered when we did design this project and had traffic studies done to design this project. Okay. I don't see the use in using council's time to go over point by point things people brought up that were previously addressed.
Thank you. I'll consider your point of order, Councillor Duncan, in that Councillor O'Keefe, as I understand it, is speaking to feedback that we've received in the correspondence and to speakers that have come forward this evening. And I think it's reasonable to speak to that. However, I will acknowledge your point that some of the points that are being referred to have been discussed at length during the active transportation process. So I will note that to Councillor O'Keefe and turn the floor back to you to consider your further remarks.
Yeah, thanks. No, I'm just kind of wrapping up. And as you say, I'm just trying to acknowledge what we've heard in the recent feedback. So I don't think we have the time tonight to get into a full discussion on this. Council and staff are not necessarily prepared to discuss this additional feedback. We have some council members who are away, so I would move that the future of the Bower Bank Bike Corridor be discussed at a future committee of the whole.
Second.
We have it moved and seconded. Councillor O'Keefe, we can consider some of your earlier remarks as motivation. Do you wish to continue to motivate?
No, I think I covered it sufficiently already. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn to Councillor Duck as the seconder, please.
Yeah, I think given the feedback we've had from certainly the neighborhood and the residents there, I also live in that neighborhood, and I have spoken with many of my neighbors around that. And now that it's come to the forefront and it's ready to go, I think the town has done an exemplary communication plan up until this point, but and I know they've got something coming forward, and I think we've got to demonstrate that we've got more communication coming out sooner and engage people with this as to what we're doing so they have an understanding of it. Whether it's right or wrong is not what I'm putting the case, but I think we have to do a better job of communicating. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan and then Councillor Novick.
Thank you. I'm going to vote against this motion for the sole reason that at this point I've been convinced that there's no point in throwing good money after bad. We've already spent a lot of money on an active transportation plan, on a climate adaptation plan, lowering greenhouse gas emissions. We've designed this project, we've done consultation for it, we've communicated a bunch, we've done traffic studies. Many of the questions, in fact, I would say all of them, that we've seen in the letters are rhetorical questions in the sense that they are asking a question about something that was already answered. And that they're not follow-up questions. They're not saying, you know, I read this and I wasn't sure, I didn't understand how you decided this. I don't think many of them actually read them or looked at the previous discussions, which were very lengthy. I think that they're intended to be gotchas, to try and prove that we somehow didn't do something because they aren't aware of it. I don't think this is productive. I think the community has made it clear. They are not interested in climate adaptation or mitigation. Like, this is, for me, has proved to me, you know, bike lanes is the thing. When I entered university in 2000, the IPCC had put out the report saying we had to keep the global heating rise to below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We broached that in 2023 and stayed there. So that level they said we needed to keep industrial society going, we passed it.
Councillor O'Keefe.
The 6 of the 9.
Councillor Duncan, I'm going to interject. We have a motion on the floor whether to refer to the committee of the whole, and I'm hearing motivation with regards to the pros and cons of the active transportation.
Yeah,
plan.
no, I'm saying I don't think we need to discuss this anymore. I don't think we need to talk about it. Let's just move it today that we cancel this project because nobody cares. Nobody wanted to try. I'm tired of pretending.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I had Councillor Novick next on the speaking list.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to support this motion because I do believe that when we get an overwhelming response from the community, we have an obligation to listen. And when the response is as overwhelming as it has been, I know Councillor O'Keefe has received personal comments about this. I have received personal comments about this. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty. I know Councillor Duncan has some valid points. Notwithstanding that, I think it's worth a final discussion at a committee of the whole level to see if there are some points that need to be addressed. There are points about safety, there are points about climate mitigation, there are points about convenience, about children going to school, etc. I think it's worth an additional half hour or whatever it'll take to fully discuss it, and perhaps we'll end up doing nothing and let the plan stand as it was designed, or perhaps we will wish to make some modifications. Either way, I think the community expects us to treat their concerns with concern and respect, and that simply means having a more fulsome discussion about this at a later date. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. Councillor Gurnett.
Thank you, Mayor. I will not support the motion, similar to Councillor Duncan, not the other part, but there has been extensive public engagement in this with regards to it as it fits into the active transportation plan. And to my recollection, throughout that process, I didn't hear any of the feedback I'm hearing now. And maybe, I don't think the details have changed that dramatically. It's just the part of the community is now upset about what has been adopted. But those comments would have been really useful during the process as we were coming to that conclusion. And they were wanting for me. I didn't hear any of this during the whole process, not that I can remember. And so I feel like we've already heard from the community. It was extensive, and Councillor O'Keefe has listed all the things that we had done. Our communications manager did a fantastic job, contrary to other comments here that I've heard in communicating this. And so I'm somewhat puzzled. I know the area very well, as Councillor O'Keefe stated. I've delivered mail there for close to 30 years at some point or another, back when it was the fish market or the processing plant. So for me, there's a bigger issue here other than what this one particular issue is bringing forth, and that is being engaged in the process when it matters. And there's lots of opportunity, and you have to seek it out. It doesn't always fall on your doorstep, although sometimes it does with the town talk. And there's so many ways that we communicate information now, and it's available to the public readily. And the opportunity for providing that feedback was when we were going through the process. To come out now after the fact, because it's not liked in certain capacities, and then have to go back and revisit that. If we did this for every single project we did in Sidney, we'd never get anything done. So I'm stating again, I will vote against it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gurnett. I'm going to speak a little bit to some of the history, and that is when we were considering the development of the active transportation plan. When the draft came forward and we went to public engagement, it came forward. There was three elements to the plan. There were the cycling corridors. Now we're referring to the Bowerbank Bikeway, but there was protected bike lanes in the downtown. And then there was this particular bikeway and others. And I'm forgetting the number of cycling corridors that were in the plan. It might have been 10 or some number thereabouts. And then there was sidewalk improvements. I think upward or somewhere in the area of 5 kilometers of additional sidewalk in the community. This plan was intended to unfold over approximately 10 years. But that was a major component to it. And then there was intersection improvements as well. So there were really 3 different areas to this. There were priorities attached to the cycling corridors. And the Bowerbank corridor, I believe, was number 3. The 2 downtown cycling corridors were the first and second priority. And there was sidewalk priorities as well. And so through that public engagement, we did hear back on 3 particular elements of the transportation plan. The first was pretty strongly that Mills Road should not be considered as a cycling corridor. The community came forward fairly strong. We received that information. We agreed with the public, and we removed that from the active transportation plan altogether. The second was concerns over the protected bike lanes as not just the first and second priorities, but being in the plan. And council took the decision to actually remove those two cycling corridors, not from the plan, but as we removed them as the first and second priority. And we chose the Bower Bank corridor as the first priority. A third thing that came forward through the public engagement was the second sidewalk on Ardwell. And we had very strong representation from that neighborhood with concerns with that. And we amended that within the active transportation plan, not to include a second sidewalk the entire length of Ardwell, but to have it at a relevant a bus stop sort of thing. So did we conduct excellent engagement? I believe we conducted excellent engagement, and I believe we received a lot of feedback, and in particular on those three elements that I referred to that we either removed from the plan, amended, or altered the priority. We didn't hear a lot, and we didn't hear much with regards to the Bower Bank Bikeway. We did have feedback on the overall active transportation plan that there were people not in favor of cycling corridors, which could be taken to include the Bower Bank. They were referring to cycling corridors, plural, sort of thing. So what is triggered where we are tonight? Well, we've had a series of engagements, whether they be during the process, whether they be through town talk afterwards, and in particular in December, through social media, the current plan, with the map was included, and that garnered a lot of response within social media, and we have now had correspondence, and we've had people come before council. We've had people come before, not in the correspondence. The correspondence is pretty one-sided, but in the individuals that came forward this evening, we heard both in favor of the plan and those opposed. And so it's not for us to make a judgment on whether our engagement was sufficient or not. We did excellent engagement, but we're hearing through particular engagement that we did, or particular information that went out to the public, we're gaining a response. I anticipate we will continue to hear from the Bower Bank neighborhood. I'm in close proximity to Bower Bank, have been for over 20 years, lived on Bower Bank for 2 years, or for a year and a half, and have lived in close proximity to Bower Bank for 20-some. But we will continue to hear, as we did tonight, we will continue to hear from both sides. I'm in support of this motion going for a discussion to council to respect the fact that some individuals did not pick up on the previous engagement, on the information from the previous engagement. I'm not going to fault those individuals. It's a process, and it's been a process over time. But I think our council discussion at a committee of the whole meeting has to be very focused in terms of what we perceive to be the concerns and those, the arguments in favor and opposed, and do we have the political will to continue to implement the Bower Bank Bikeway as the first priority. It was a major plan for this council. It was a major strategic priority stemming from the last term in council and carried forward into this council. So I appreciate everything that transpired, and I think we have followed a good process as a town and as a council, but we are hearing an increasing number of Bower Bank residents come forward, and I think we do need to listen to a degree. We need to listen to all input, and then choose to reaffirm going forward. I made a remark there. I wasn't trying to be prophetic, but I made a remark when we were approving the Bower Bank corridor as the #1 priority, is that given that it was the first active transportation initiative in terms of a cycling corridor, we've of course had sidewalks for a long time, is there would be learnings in the process and in implementing it, and I still believe that. And we are learning some things in terms of what our Bower Bank neighborhood residents' priorities. But quite frankly, Bower Bank serves not just the immediate Bower Bank residents, but it actually serves a larger part of our community because of the road that it is. So I'll leave my remarks there and indicate that I'm supportive at this time, and I'll turn for a second time to Councillor Gannett.
Thank you, Mayor, and this may be a question through you to staff. We applied for a grant, so I'm wondering if any of this will have any impact on the grant application process.
Mr. Edwards or Mr. Hissick?
I don't know exactly what the timelines are for the use of the grant funds, but the grant application did indicate construction would begin in 2025. And typically you have about a year or two to complete. I don't know, I'm not prepared with that information tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Gannett. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? With Councillor Duncan opposed and Councillor Gannett opposed, the motion carries. Thank you, Council. We're turning to item 15, which is the remaining correspondence for information. It is being received by virtue of being on our agenda. We don't require a motion. We have no notices of motion this evening, so I'm turning to number 17 and thank Councillor Gannett in advance for reading the two motions to go in camera.
Okay, I'm reading a revised one, correct?
No, you're reading this one,
Both?
both of them. What's on our agenda and then this one
And then,
in
okay.
addition.
Just the revised one?
Just the revised?
Okay.
My apologies.
Final answer? Okay. I'm going to move the recommendation that is in the opinion of council that the public interest requires that persons other than members of the council and officers be excluded from the meeting to consider confidential matters regarding the acquisition, disposition, or expropriation of land or improvements and personal information about an individual being considered for an award or honor pursuant to section 90.1E and B of the community charter, and that council continue the meeting in closed session.
Second.
We have it moved and seconded. All in favor? The motion carries. Thank you. We will continue the meeting in closed session. We'll recess for 5 minutes.
Motion to adjourn. General meeting?
No, we're continuing the meeting in closed session.